Do you think history is written by kings and nobles? Do you think freedom is won through treaties and parliaments? Prepare to discard everything you've learned. The story you're about to watch proves that sometimes a single man, a nobody without land, title, or army, can rise from the ashes of oppression and bring the most powerful king in the world to his knees. But this is not the story you saw in the movies. The truth is more brutal, more complex, and more inspiring. We are talking about a time when bowing down was the only way to survive, and one man chose to die standing. He did not fight for power, for he surrendered it. He did not fight for glory, for he was hunted like an animal. This is the story of how one man's personal revenge for the murder of his wife became the spark that ignited the soul of a nation. And the most shocking part? His greatest triumph led to his downfall, and his most humiliating death became his greatest victory. If you're ready to discover the true story of William Wallace, from Stirling's tactical genius to the bitter betrayal at Falkirk and the final defense that sealed his legacy, stay with us. And if you believe that stories like this need to be told, help us spread this knowledge. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because our work is to rescue these heroes from the mists of time. Your subscription is the reward that allows us to continue this journey. And while you watch, comment below which city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories of freedom reach. And of course, if there's an epic story, a forgotten hero you desperately want to see told, suggest it in the comments. We read every single one of them. Now, get ready. The real story of Braveheart begins. In the mists of the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Scotland experienced a period of such remarkable prosperity that it would be remembered with melancholy as the Golden Age. For more than 3 decades, King Alexander III ruled with a firm and just hand, weaving a delicate balance of power. He had secured the independence of his crown against the ambitions of his southern neighbor, the powerful King Edward I of England. This was not a peace of submission, but of mutual respect, solidified by marriage alliances, but with a clear distinction between the kingdoms. Under Alexander, the law was upheld, trade with the continent flourished, and the clamor of arms, so common in other lands, seemed a distant memory. Scotland was a proud, sovereign kingdom, secure in its future. However, fate weaves its threads with indifferent cruelty, and the stability of an entire nation rested on the fragile foundation of the royal lineage. Alexander's once robust family tree had been brutally pruned by tragedy. His 2 promising sons and his beloved daughter Margaret, who had become Queen of Norway, had died. The only thread of hope, the only direct heir to the Scottish throne, was a 7-year-old child living across the sea, his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Then, on the fateful night of March 19, 1286, Scotland itself seemed to hold its breath. King Alexander III in Edinburgh was determined to cross the Firth of Forth to reunite with his young second wife, Yolande of Dreux, at Kinghorn. A violent storm, a true fury of nature, swept the coast. His advisors pleaded with him not to travel. Legend, though without historical proof, claims that a seer warned him of a powerful wind that would sweep across Scotland the following day. Disregarding the warnings, the king set off into the howling darkness. Separated from his guides by the force of the storm, Alexander III and his horse plunged off a steep cliff. The next morning, the broken body of Scotland's last great Celtic king was found among the rocks. The Golden Age was over. The wind of prophecy was not of air, but of chaos and death. Scotland was kingless. The impact was immediate and devastating. An orphaned kingdom plunged into uncertainty. To avoid anarchy, the most powerful nobles formed a council known as the 6 Guardians of Scotland, appointed to govern on behalf of the young, absent queen. The priority was clear: bring the Maid of Norway home and secure independence. In 1290, the Treaty of Bergen seemed a brilliant diplomatic solution. The young Queen Margaret would marry the English heir, the future Edward II. The treaty, however, was meticulous in its language, stating that Scotland would remain separate, distinct, and free in itself, without subjection to the Kingdom of England. It promised peace, alliance, and above all, sovereignty. But the storm that had taken Alexander seemed not to have dissipated. In the autumn of that same year, a ship sailed from Norway carrying the young queen toward her kingdom. The frail child, however, did not withstand the tumultuous crossing. She fell ill and died shortly after disembarking in the Orkney Islands, before her feet even touched Scottish soil. The news fell upon the kingdom like an axe blow. The direct line of Alexander III was extinct. The throne was not only vacant, the succession itself was broken. The chaos, once contained, now exploded. 13 men from various noble lineages presented their claims to the throne, an event known as the Great Cause. The two strongest claimants, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather, began to gather their armies. Scotland was on the brink of a civil war that would destroy it from within. In an act of desperation and fatal naivete, the Guardians and the Pretenders turned south. They asked the only man they believed had the power and authority to mediate the dispute without bloodshed, King Edward I of England. It was like inviting a wolf to oversee the flock. Edward, the shrewd statesman and ruthless warrior who dreamed of unifying all of Great Britain under his single command, saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Scotland, fragmented, leaderless, and now willingly placing itself under his judgment, was ripe for conquest. The age of peace was dead. The age of William Wallace was about to be born. Edward I of England, the king who answered the desperate call of the Scots, was no ordinary monarch. Tall, imposing, and with a reputation forged in relentless wars in Wales and the Crusades. He was known as much for his almost fanatical devotion to the law as for his ambition to unify the entire island of Great Britain under his single rule. He was Longshanks, a shrewd warrior and loyalist, and in 1291, he saw Scotland's great cause not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be exploited. He summoned the Scottish nobles and the 13 claimants to the throne to meet him, not on neutral ground, but at Norham, on the English side of the border. The scene was one of military might and legal pomp. There, before any discussion of the claims could begin, Edward I struck his first blow, a diplomatic coup that revealed his true intentions. He did not position himself as an impartial mediator, but as a feudal judge. And as a judge, he demanded payment. His demand was simple in its formulation and devastating in its implications. Before he would hear a single case, all claimants and guardians of Scotland had to formally acknowledge him as Lord Paramount of Scotland. Edward's demand paralyzed the Scots. It was poison served in a golden cup. To accept meant voluntarily surrendering the sovereignty for which their ancestors had fought, making the future King of Scotland a mere vassal of the King of England. To refuse meant being excluded from the contest, and, more dangerously, provoking the immediate wrath of Christendom's most formidable army, already assembled on the other side of the river. The claimants, each more concerned with their own ambition to wear the crown than with its integrity, found themselves trapped. One by one, including the powerful John Balliol and Robert Bruce the grandfather, they yielded. The Bishop of Glasgow, Robert Wishart, is said to have murmured in protest that only the people of Scotland could grant such sovereignty, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of quills on parchment. Scotland, to save itself from civil war, had chained itself to a master. With his legal authority now uncontested, Edward I presided over the great cause. The process was meticulous, lengthy, and deliberately demonstrative of English power. After months of legal deliberations, the choice was narrowed down to Balliol and Bruce. In November 1292, Edward I delivered his verdict. John Balliol would be king. The choice was legally defensible. Balliol had the stronger claim based on the feudal primogeniture laws that Edward favored, but it was also politically astute. Balliol was seen as a weaker, more compliant man with extensive holdings in England, making him easier to control than the fierce and elderly Bruce. John Balliol was crowned King of Scots, but the shadow of Edward I loomed long over his throne. The honeymoon, if there ever was one, was brief. The Lord Supreme immediately began to wield his newfound authority, not as a distant protector, but as an interventionist master. The Treaty of Berghem, which guaranteed Scotland's legal and judicial independence, was torn up in practice. Edward I encouraged disgruntled Scottish nobles to appeal King John's judicial decisions directly to English courts. In an act of supreme humiliation, King John Balliol himself was summoned to Westminster to answer accusations from common subjects. The tomb-tabard king, as he became pejoratively known, was a monarch in name only. The final humiliation came in 1294. Edward I, now embroiled in a costly war against King Philip IV of France, demanded that his Scottish vassal, King John, and the Scottish nobles provide men and money to fight for the English army on the continent. For the Scots, this was a step too far. Legal submission was one thing. Being forced to shed blood in a war that wasn't theirs by a master who despised them was another. The Scottish nobility reacted with fury. They formed a Council of 12, effectively removing power from Baliol's hands and ruling in his name. In 1295, they took a drastic step that would define Scottish foreign policy for centuries. They signed the Old Alliance with France, a pact of mutual defense against England. For Edward I, this was more than insubordination, it was treason. The vassal had rebelled. The arbiter would now become the conqueror. He gathered his vast army and marched north, no longer to judge, but to crush. The hammer of the Scots was about to fall, and the first city in his path was the prosperous Berwick-upon-Tweed. Scotland's independence, delivered on a scroll at Norham, would now have to be won back with blood and steel. Edward I's response to the Auld Alliance was immediate and brutal. In March 1296, he appeared at the gates of Berwick-upon-Tweed, Scotland's richest and most vital trading city, and demanded its immediate surrender. When the city refused, the hammer of the Scots fell without mercy. The English army, a professional war machine, stormed the city's defenses. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. For 3 days, the city was sacked, with thousands of citizens, men, women, and children slaughtered in the streets. The sack of Berwick was a calculated act of state terrorism, designed to break the Scottish spirit and send a clear message: resistance would be punished with annihilation. King John Balliol, now fully controlled by the Council of 12, responded by formally renouncing his vassalage to Edward. It was an empty and belated gesture. The Scottish army, hastily assembled and composed mainly of poorly equipped feudal infantry, attempted to intercept the English advance at Dunbar. The English heavy cavalry, led by the veteran Earl of Surrey, shattered the Scottish ranks in a matter of minutes. The Battle of Dunbar was a humiliating and decisive defeat. The Scottish army was destroyed, and most of its noble leadership, including 3 earls, was captured. Organized resistance had evaporated. With Scotland defenseless, Edward I embarked on a triumphant march, a victory journey through the heart of the kingdom. He moved from castle to castle, accepting the surrender of fortresses that barely dared to resist. His journey took him to Stirling Castle, which he found abandoned, then to Perth, and finally north to Elgin. But his most symbolic act of conquest occurred at Scone, the spiritual heart of the Scottish monarchy. There he took possession of the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation, stone upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries. He removed it from its place in Scone Abbey and sent it to London, to be placed beneath the English coronation throne in Westminster Abbey. The message was unequivocal. The Scottish monarchy was finished. It was now literally under the feet of England. The military and symbolic humiliation was then sealed with a legal humiliation. On July 2, 1296, at Montrose, King John Balliol was formally stripped of his power. In a pathetic ceremony, the royal coat of arms of Scotland was torn from his coat, permanently giving him the nickname Tomb Tabard, or empty coat. He was forced to abdicate the throne and surrender as a prisoner, being sent to the Tower of London. With the king deposed and the army scattered, Edward I convened an assembly, a parliament, in Berwick. It was there that he demanded the final act of total submission. More than 2,000 Scottish leaders, earls, barons, knights, bishops, and burghers, were summoned to appear and, one by one, place their names and seals on an instrument of vassalage. This document became known in history as the Ragman Roll. The name may derive from the appearance of the numerous wax seals hung on the parchments by ribbons or rags, or perhaps from the name of a medieval game of chance, reflecting the wager lost by Scotland. Signing the Ragman Roll was more than a formality. It was a confession of treason and an oath of unconditional allegiance to Edward I each. Signatory publicly acknowledged the English king as their sole and sovereign lord. Among the names that signed, we find almost the entire Scottish aristocracy, including notably Sir Malcolm Wallace, the father of William Wallace, and, on a separate parchment, the name of Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, the man who would one day become King Robert the Bruce. Signing the Ragman Roll became the ultimate test of loyalty. Those who refused were declared outlaws, their lands and titles confiscated. With the scrolls signed, Edward I believed he had completed his conquest. He left Scotland under the control of English administrators, the Earl of Surrey as governor, Hugh of Cressingham as treasurer, and Sir Walter of Heselrig as High Sheriff of Lanark. Scotland was no longer a kingdom. It was a province, an occupied land. Edward, I had, in his mind, erased Scotland from the map as an independent nation. He had taken away its king, its sacred stone, its army, and now the sworn signatures of its leaders. But in those same hills and valleys he had traversed, a young knight of the minor nobility, whose family had also bowed, watched the humiliation. For Edward, the ragman role was the end of the story. For men like William Wallace, it was the beginning. While official Scotland, the Scotland of earls and barons, bent the knee and signed its submission on the ragman role. The man who would become the symbol of its liberation was an almost invisible figure in historical records. William Wallace was not a great feudal lord. He did not possess vast estates or a private army. He was a member of the lesser nobility, a minor knight from the Renfrewshire region, a second son with limited prospects. Official history, written by the victors and administrators, had no reason to take note of him before 1297. The void left by history was filled, almost 2 centuries later, by one of the most influential works of Scottish literature, the epic poem, The Deeds and Acts of the Illustrious and Valiant Champion, Sir William Wallace, written around 1470 by a minstrel known as Blind Harry. It is crucial to understand that this work is not history as we understand it. It is folklore, romance, and patriotic propaganda written during a later period of renewed conflict with England. However, it was Harry's work that created the immortal image of Wallace and provided the narrative of his youth. A narrative that, while lacking factual proof, explains the origin of the fire that would consume Scotland. According to Harry's legend, William's father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, refused to sign the ragman roll and was forced to flee with his eldest son, while William was sent to safety and ecclesiastical education. Young Wallace, described by Harry as a man of almost gigantic stature, prodigious strength, and a fierce temperament, was placed under the guardianship of his uncles. One of them, according to tradition, was a priest in Dunepis, a learned man who saw in his nephew not only a warrior, but a mind to be molded. It was that clergyman uncle who supposedly taught Wallace Latin and French, but more importantly, planted the seeds of ideological rebellion. He taught young William not only the scriptures, but the stories of ancient Scottish liberty, the tallies of Celtic heroes who had resisted the Romans and the Angles. In a world where nobles accepted English suzerainty as a political reality, Wallace's uncle instilled in him a deeper moral truth, that liberty was a divine right and submission to a tyrant was a sin. Tradition attributes to this uncle the Latin phrase that would become Wallace's creed, a mantra that Harry the Blind places in the heart of his hero. As they watched English oppression grow, the uncle is said to have uttered, "I tell you the truth. Freedom is the best of all things. Never live under the bond of servitude, my son. I tell you the truth. Freedom is the best of all things. My son, never live under the bonds of slavery." This phrase, real or invented, encapsulates the motivation that official history fails to explain. It transforms Wallace's rebellion from a simple act of banditry into a philosophical holy war. Another legendary figure in his upbringing was Sir Ronald Crawford, his maternal uncle and Sheriff of Ayr, appointed by the Scottish crown. Through him, Wallace would have learned not only the ways of the sword and spear, but also the politics of the nobility and the administration of Scottish law, the same law that was now being trampled by the English. The poem by Blind Harry portrays Wallace's youth not as that of a passive student, but as that of a reluctant outlaw, constantly provoked by the arrogance of the English occupiers. There are tallies, all unverified, of his early confrontations: a fatal brawl with English soldiers in Dundee after a dispute over fish, a confrontation with the son of the English constable of Dundee, which ended with the young nobleman's death. These stollies, though probably fictional, serve a crucial narrative purpose. They establish Wallace as a man who, by his very nature, was incapable of yielding. His personal honor and his hatred of injustice made him a powder keg in an occupied landscape, just waiting for the final spark. Thus, when the English Sheriff of Lanark, Sir Walter de Heselrig, began to rule the region with an iron fist, he was not dealing with a subjugated peasant or a calculating nobleman. He was about to clash with a man who, according to the legend that would define a nation, had been indoctrinated from childhood with a single, inflexible idea: freedom is the best of all things. The true story of his youth may be lost, but the legend of his upbringing created the hero Scotland needed. William Wallace's education by his uncles forged his mind with the ideology of liberty. It was the tragedy at Lanark that, according to legend, forged his heart with an implacable fury. Scotland, as a whole, suffered under the boot of English occupation. But for the poet Harry the Blind, Wallace's war needed a more intimate and devastating catalyst than mere political oppression. History needed a personal martyr, and it found one in the figure of Marion Braidfield. In historical records, Marion Braidfield is a shadow. She may have been the heiress to the Lamington lands, but her connection to Wallace is based entirely on Harry's epic poem. In this narrative, she is not merely a romantic interest, she is Wallace's secret wife. In a time when any union with a Scotsman known for his defiant temperament was dangerous, their marriage was kept secret. Marion represented for Wallace the life that could have been, the peace, the family, and the future that the English occupation made impossible. She was his secret refuge in a land that no longer belonged to him. The man who ruled Lanark with absolute power was Sir Walter de Heselrigge. The English High Sheriff appointed by Edward I Heselrigge was the personification of the tyranny of the occupation, arrogant, cruel, and utterly disdainful of the local population. Wallace, already known to the English as a troublemaker and a man of dangerous strength and inflexible pride, was a constant target of harassment by the Lanark garrison. Legend has it that in 1297 Wallace was in the town of Lanark, possibly on his way to church, accompanied by Marion. They were confronted by English soldiers who mocked him, taunting him about his fine attire or the dagger he carried. The taunting escalated rapidly, as was common. The soldiers' arrogance, confident in their authority, clashed with Wallace's indomitable pride. The ensuing fight was brief and deadly. Wallace, a master of the blade, killed several of the soldiers and, in the confusion, managed to escape through the narrow streets of Lanark, fleeing to the house where he and Marion secretly lived. Heselrigge, enraged by the death of his men and by Wallace's audacity in defying his authority in broad daylight, was swift in his revenge. He did not pursue Wallace immediately. He knew how to wound him more deeply. The sheriff went directly to Wallace's house and captured Marion Braidfield. She was accused not only of being Wallace's accomplice, but of marrying him, an outlaw in the eyes of the English, thus defying the king's authority. What followed was not a trial, but a show of power. Sir Walter de Heselrigge, in an act of calculated cruelty designed to break the spirit of any potential rebel, dragged Marion into the public square of Lanark and executed her. She was hanged, a grim spectacle to terrify the population and serve as a brutal warning to her fugitive husband. Wallace, hidden in the nearby hills or woods, would have seen the fire or heard the screams. The news that his refuge, the embodiment of his personal life and happiness, had been publicly destroyed, broke him. But from that rupture was born not despair, but a cold and absolute fury. The legend is clear on this point. The man who fled Lanark was an outlaw. The man who returned that very night was an avenger. Wallace's war for Scotland became, at that instant, a personal war against Walter of Heselrigge. The abstract oppression of England now had a face. The face of the sheriff who murdered his wife. Freedom, the philosophical concept taught by his uncle, now merged with the primal desire for revenge. The hammer of the Scots had inadvertently ignited a flame that would consume not only Lanark, but the entire kingdom. The night that followed Marion Braidfield's execution was silent, but it was the silence of a predator, not of peace. For Sir Walter de Heselrigge, the English sheriff of Lanark, the day had been a success. He had eliminated a local troublemaker, executed the wife of an outlaw, and reaffirmed Edward I's dominion over the town. Probably retired to his quarters in the castle, or the fortified house that served as English headquarters. Satisfied with the brutal order he had imposed. He had fundamentally underestimated the man he had provoked. He mistook William Wallace's flight for cowardice, not realizing it was a tactical retreat, a moment for pain to turn to steel. Wallace did not wait. He did not flee north to mourn or west to hide. That very night, he returned to Lanark. He was not alone. The public murder of Marion, a well-known woman in the town, was the last straw not only for Wallace, but for the citizens of Falkirk, who lived under the daily fear and humiliation imposed by the English garrison. Men of the town, some possibly friends of Wallace. Others, simply desperate men who had nothing left to lose, gathered around him in the darkness. The poem by Harry the Blind suggests that he gathered a small band, perhaps 30 men, armed with what they could: daggers, short axes, and righteous fury. The attack was swift, brutal, and surgical. They moved through the dark alleys of Lanark like ghosts, knowing every lane and passageway in a way that English soldiers never could. The target wasn't the entire garrison, at least not initially. The target was one man. Wallace led his men directly to the sheriff's quarters. The door was broken down without warning. Heselrigg, jolted from his sleep or his supper, barely had time to react. He didn't face a trial, just as Marion didn't face hers. He faced William Wallace. Tradition, fueled by the narrative of Harry the Blind, is graphically vivid about what happened. Wallace, described as a giant in his rage, is said to have confronted the sheriff and fatally struck him with his sword. Harry claims that Wallace dismembered Heselrigg's body, an act of revenge in the name of an eye for an eye, reflecting the brutality the sheriff had inflicted on Marion and other Scots. While the exact nature of his death is uncertain to the story, the outcome is not. Sir Walter de Heselrigg was killed and his body mutilated, a horrific warning to his superiors. But the night did not end there. The sheriff's death was the signal. Wallace's small band, now inflamed by blood, turned against the sleeping garrison. They attacked the English barracks, setting the buildings ablaze. The soldiers, confused, disoriented, and leaderless, were slaughtered as they tried to escape the flames. Wallace's personal vendetta instantly became a military insurrection. By dawn, the English garrison at Lanark had been effectively annihilated, and the castle, the symbol of English power in the region, was in flames. This event, which occurred in May 1297, was the thunder that heralded the storm. It was not the first act of resistance. Other small fires of rebellion had already been occurring throughout Scotland. But it was the boldest, the most personal, and the most symbolically powerful. A royal sheriff, the direct representative of Edward I, had been challenged, killed, and dismembered by a minor knight. The news spread like wildfire. For the English administrators in Berwick, it was a shocking act of banditry. For the oppressed Scots, it was a ray of hope. It was proof that the English regime was not invincible. It was proof that a Scotsman could fight back. The act at Lanark marked a point of no return. William Wallace was no longer just a local outlaw fleeing a murder charge. He was now public enemy number one of the occupying regime. He had declared war, not in the name of a king or a noble council, but in the name of vengeance and freedom. He could no longer hide. His only option was to fight. The revenge of Lanark was the baptism of fire of Wallace's rebellion, transforming a grieving man into a war leader and igniting the spark that would become the first war of Scottish independence. The burning of Lanark and the brutal death of its sheriff were the spark that ignited the preamble. William Wallace's act of vengeance, however personal in origin, instantly became an act of political warfare. The English administration, led by the Governor Earl of Surrey and, more pragmatically, by Treasurer Hugh de Cressingham, a man better known for his miserly accounting than for his military subtlety, reacted with predictable fury. Wallace was no longer a mere local troublemaker. He was declared a traitor to the English crown, an outlaw with a substantial price on his head. Every sheriff, constable, and nobleman loyal to Edward I now had a duty to hunt him down and bring him to justice, dead or alive. For a lesser nobleman without land, army, or castle, this should have been a swift death sentence. But the English administration made a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that by crushing the nobility at Dunbar and humiliating them with the ragman role, they had broken the backbone of Scotland. They didn't understand the common people. For the peasants, the small landowners, yeomen, and the town burghers, the occupation wasn't an abstract question of suzerainty. It was a daily reality of crushing taxes levied by Cressingham, of arrogant garrisons that took their food, and of a foreign justice system that despised their customs. They didn't see Wallace as a traitor. They saw him as the first man to fight back. So, instead of finding himself isolated, Wallace became a magnet. From the hills of Clydesdale and the valleys of Ayrshire, men began to seek him out. They were not the great feudal lords. These, for the most part, remained paralyzed by fear, watching from their castles to see which way the wind blew. Wallace's first followers were desperate men like himself, younger sons without inheritance, peasants whose farms had been burned, merchants ruined by Cressingham's taxes, and even some low-ranking clergymen who preached freedom from the pulpit. They were joined by lesser knights, such as Sir John the Graham, who would become one of Wallace's closest friends and most trusted lieutenants. Without a castle to defend himself, Wallace took his war to the only place where a professional English army was vulnerable: the land. He transformed the vast, ancient Ettrick forest and the dense woods of Selkirk into his fortress. The trees were his walls, the hidden paths his corridors. From these green sanctuaries, Wallace stopped fighting like a knight and began fighting like a ghost. He traded the cavalry charge for the ambush. He and his growing band, which soon became a small, irregular army, waged guerrilla warfare with terrifying effectiveness. Their target was the infrastructure of the occupation. Wallace knew that the English army could not live off Scottish land forever. It needed supplies, money, and communication from the south. And so, Wallace hunted down supply convoys. His men descended from the hills like wolves, attacking wagons of grain, barrels of wine, and, most importantly, the tax coffers of Cressingham. Each captured convoy weakened the enemy and simultaneously armed and fueled his own rebellion. They attacked small garrisons, isolated outposts that the English had established to control the countryside. They would appear in the middle of the night, scale palisades, take down the sentries, and disappear before the alarm could be raised or reinforcements could arrive from larger castles like Roxburgh or Jedburgh. English officials, tax collectors, and messengers began to fear solitary journeys. The Scottish landscape itself seemed to have turned against them. Wallace's reputation grew with each successful attack. To the English administrators, he was a bloodthirsty bandit, a thief and murderer. To the Scots, he became something more. He was a symbol that resistance was possible. He humiliated the English, stole their supplies, and escaped their clutches. Tales of his audacity, his physical strength, and his tactical cunning began to spread. However, Wallace, a pragmatic leader, knew the truth. Guerrilla warfare could bleed England dry, but it could not drive it out. He could control the countryside, but the English controlled the castles. His rebellion, though popular and successful, lacked two crucial things: noble legitimacy and a trained army capable of facing the English in open battle. He was winning skirmishes in the south, but little did he know that far to the north, another man, a nobleman of ancient blood, was waging a war of his own. While William Wallace was becoming the terror of English trains in the south, a parallel and equally potent drama was unfolding in the Northern Highlands. The English administration, focused on Wallace's banditry in Clydesdale, gravely underestimated the depth of Scottish resentment. Oppression knew no geography. Far from Wallace's guerrilla attacks, another man, of very different lineage, had raised the banner of rebellion. His name was Andrew Moray, or de Moore, and he was everything Wallace was not. Moray was no minor knight or outlaw of the people. He was a member of the high nobility, the son of Sir Andrew Moray of Petty, one of the most powerful men in northern Scotland, and a captured signatory of the Ragman Roll, who now languished in an English prison. Young Andrew Moray, like his father, had fought in the disastrous Battle of Dunbar, and had also been captured. He was imprisoned in Chester Castle, but unlike many of his peers, his will did not break. In the spring of 1297, almost at the same time that Wallace attacked Lanark, Moray managed a daring escape from his English prison and secretly returned to his ancestral stronghold at Avoch Castle in the Black Isle region. Unlike Wallace, who had to build an army from peasants and small landowners, Moray had the power of his name. He was the rightful heir to vast lands, and his vassals answered his call. The north, which the English believed to be pacified, erupted in flames. Moray proved to be a brilliant military leader, as shrewd as Wallace, but with formal military training. He and his men, including the loyal Alexander Pilche, waged a swift and effective war to regain control of the northern strongholds. They attacked Urquhart Castle on the shores of Loch Ness, and although they did not manage to take it immediately, the siege demonstrated their strength. In rapid succession, Moray and his army, which grew daily with lesser nobles in their retinues, took the castles of Inverness, Elgin, Banff, and Aberdeen. Within months, Andrew Moray had effectively liberated all of northern Scotland from English control. Scotland now had two distinct and simultaneous rebellion leaders. In the south, there was Wallace, the man of the people, a charismatic leader whose war was visceral, personal, and guerrilla-based. In the north, there was Moray, the aristocrat, a strategic leader whose war was dynastic, organized, and based on the recapture of fortresses. The English administration in Berwick, now in a panic, realized that it was not facing a band of thieves, but a coordinated national insurrection. Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer, wrote frantic letters to King Edward I, who was in Flanders, complaining that his tax revenue had evaporated and that Scotland was lost, except for the castles themselves. Wallace and Moray knew of each other's existence through messengers and the very spread of the rebellion. Both realized a fundamental truth: alone, they could only win half the war. Wallace controlled the countryside in the south, but lacked the siege equipment or noble authority to seize the great castles. Moray controlled the north, but the English could easily concentrate their forces against him if the south remained pacified. And, most importantly, any English army sent to retake Scotland would inevitably march south, passing through the strategic choke point of Stirling. At the end of the summer of 1297, the two leaders made a decision that would change the course of the war. They marched with their respective armies to a meeting point. The exact location is unknown, but it was probably near Dundee or Perth. This meeting is one of the most profound moments in Scottish history. On one side, William Wallace, the outlaw, the avenger of Lanark, followed by thousands of battle-hardened commoners. On the other, Andrew Moray, the fugitive nobleman, heir to Petty, accompanied by trained knights and loyal vassals. The alliance between them was immediate and pragmatic. They did not dispute command. They shared it. They issued letters and proclamations not in their own names, but as commanders of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland, acting on behalf of King John Balliol, who was still a prisoner in England. This alliance was an unprecedented fusion of power. It united the people and the nobility, the North and the South, guerrilla warfare, and formal military strategy. Wallace's rebellion gained the aristocratic legitimacy it lacked, and Moray's war gained the popular force and righteous fury of the South. Together, they were no longer two rebels. They were a unified national army, ready to confront the might of England. No longer in the shadows of the forests, but an open field. And both knew exactly where this battle would have to be fought. At Stirling Castle and Bridge, the key that locked the gate between the Highlands and the Lowlands. Across the border, in the occupied castles of Berwick and Roxburgh, the panic of the English administration was turning into military fury. News of the alliance between Wallace and Moray was the final nightmare. What Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer, had initially dismissed as bandit riots and what the governor, John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, had treated with complacent slowness, was now undeniably a national insurrection. The North was lost. The South was out of control. The tax coffers were empty. Desperate messages were sent to King Edward I in Flanders, who, furious at having his continental war interrupted by trouble in a kingdom he considered conquered, sent unequivocal orders: crush this rebellion, whatever the cost. The Earl of Surrey, the principal English commander in Scotland, was an elderly and experienced war veteran. He had been the architect of the lightning victory at Dunbar the previous year, a battle that had broken the Scottish feudal army in minutes. To him, this new revolt, led by a renegade nobleman Moray and an outlaw commoner Wallace, was an offense, but not an existential threat. He would gather the professional English army and repeat the lesson of Dunbar. Accompanying him was Hugh de Cressingham. Cressingham was not a soldier. He was a clergyman and an administrator, an obese and miserly man, universally hated by the Scots for his extortionate taxes. But he was the direct representative of the king's treasury and, in his arrogance, saw himself also as a military strategist, eager to end the war so he could return to collecting taxes. The English war machine began to move. This was no group of local garrisons. Edward I had left a substantial occupying force composed of veterans of the Welsh Wars. From Berwick and Carlisle marched a professional army of perhaps 10,000 infantrymen, including the feared Welsh archers, and most importantly some 2,000 to 3,000 heavy cavalry. This cavalry was the war tank of the medieval era, an elite, armored, and trained shock force against which no peasant infantry could supposedly stand. These were the same men who had crushed the Scottish Schiltrons at Dunbar. Accompanying them was a vast supply train, a moving city, demonstrating the logistical might and wealth of the English crown. As this army advanced heavily northward in late August 1297, it received news that seemed to confirm its superiority. The Scottish high nobility, the great lords who had signed the ragman roll, made their own move. Men like Robert Bruce, the future king, the Earl of Carrick, and James Stewart, the High Guardian of Scotland, gathered their own armies at Irvine. It was the nobility's chance to unite with Wallace and Moray. However, when a smaller English force led by Henry de Percy confronted them, the nobles' momentum faltered. Divided, fearful of losing their lands and despising Wallace's commoners, they entered into negotiations. In July 1297, they signed the capitulation of Irvine, surrendering to the English without firing a single shot, in exchange for pardons and guarantees of their properties. For Surrey and Cressingham, the war was essentially won. The real Scotland, the Scotland of nobles and knights, had surrendered. All that remained was Wallace and Moray's mongrel army, a rabble they presumed to be encamped somewhere near the strategic stronghold of Stirling. The arrogance of the English commanders was inflated by this easy diplomatic victory. Cressingham, in particular, was impatient. He complained about the cost of keeping the army in the field and urged Surrey to advance quickly to disperse the remaining rebels and declare Scotland pacified. Thus, the English army marched to Stirling, not expecting a battle, but an execution. They were not marching against equals, but against traitors and peasants. Surrey, suffering from gout and preferring the comfort of barrack, was slow and reluctant, but was pressed by Cressingham's impatience. They did not know that Wallace and Moray, aware of the surrender at Irvine, had not been discouraged. The treachery of the high nobility only purified their cause. They were no longer fighting for feudal lords. They were fighting for Scotland itself. They had arrived at Stirling first and chosen their terrain, not in the open field, but on the heights of Craig Abbey, a high ground that dominated the landscape. And between them and the approaching English army there was a river, a swamp, and a dangerously narrow bridge. Surrey's professional army was about to meet the unified wrath of Moray and Wallace. Whoever controls Stirling controls Scotland. This was no mere catchphrase. It was an absolute geographical and military truth. Stirling Castle, perched atop an imposing volcanic rock, guarded the lowest and most strategic crossing point of the River Forth. The river, wide and swampy to the east and the impassable hills to the west, created a funnel. All traffic, all trade, and most importantly, all armies, moving between the southern lowlands and the northern highlands, had to pass through this buckle that united the kingdom. William Wallace and Andrew Moray, now co-commanders of the Army of the Kingdom of Scotland, knew this. And the Earl of Surrey, commander of the English army, knew it too. The English garrison still controlled Stirling Castle, but the castle was not the prize. The prize was the bridge. The Scottish army arrived first, a crucial tactical advantage. But they did not take up defensive positions in the city of Stirling, nor attempt to besiege the castle. Instead, Moray and Wallace made a move of strategic genius. They led their army, a force of perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 infantrymen, composed of hardened commoners, town burghers, and Moray's lesser cavalry, north of the river. They scaled and occupied the heights of Craig Abbey, a steep, wooded hill that rose directly above the river plain. From this vantage point, they had a panoramic and divine view of the entire battlefield unfolding below. They could see the castle, the city, and, most importantly, the bridge. And what a bridge it was. It wasn't a grand stone structure, but a narrow wooden bridge, perhaps wide enough for only 2 horsemen or 3 or 4 men on foot to cross it side by side. It stretched from the firm ground to the south, where the English would arrive, to a low swampy plain on the north side. This plain, the Carse of Stirling, was treacherous terrain, cut by a winding meander of the river. In essence, the bridge led not to safe ground, but to a natural trap, an area of soft, waterlogged land encircled by the river, where large-scale maneuvers, especially by heavy cavalry, would be slow, difficult, and deadly. Wallace and Moray did not choose to defend the bridge. They chose to use it as a weapon, a funnel for slaughter. On September 10, 1297, Surrey and Cressingham's English army arrived on the south bank. It was a sight designed to inspire terror and demand immediate surrender. Thousands of Welsh and English infantrymen, a forest of banners, and most fearsome of all, thousands of heavy cavalry, the armored elite of Christendom. They looked across the river to Craig Abbey and saw what they presumed to be a rabble of Scottish rebels. a disorganized mob positioned on a hill like sheep awaiting slaughter. The arrogance was palpable. Surrey and Cressingham camped confidently, presuming that the mere sight of their might would cause the Scots to scatter. Thus began the tense standoff. For 2 days, the two armies faced off across the River Forth. For the English, the issue was simply logistics, how to cross that irritating bridge most efficiently to disperse the rebels. For the Scots on the hill, it was a test of patience. Every soldier in Wallace and Moray's army knew that their only trump card was that terrain. They observed, sharpened their spears, and waited. It's one of those breathtaking moments in history, a turning point where the fate of a nation rests on the discipline of a few thousand men waiting on a hill. It's a story of courage that echoes through the centuries, and if you, like us, believe that these stories of freedom and strategy deserve to be told, help us spread this knowledge. Subscribing to the channel is the best way to ensure we continue to bring these epic narratives to life. And if this chapter of Wallace's story is already captivating you, leave a like so that more people can discover this incredible battle. As tensions mounted in Stirling, with English knights testing the bridge approach and being met with shouts of defiance from the Scots, the standoff seemed like it could last for days. The English were professionals, the Scots were patriots. And speaking of patriotism and stories that travel, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Leave your city, state, or country in the comments. It's fascinating for us to see how far the flame of Scottish independence shines today. Your story, or the story of your region, could also be an epic waiting to be told. Is there a story or hero you'd like to suggest for a future video? Leave your suggestion in the comments. We read them all. On the night of September 10th, the English commanders debated. The Scots watched. The bridge remained silent under the moon, the focal point of the entire war. Surrey, the veteran, was cautious. Cressingham, the accountant, was impatient. And on the hill, Wallace and Moray stood together, waiting for the mistake they knew English arrogance would inevitably make. At dawn on September 11th, 1297, the morning mist slowly rose from the River Forth, revealing the two armies in their unchanged positions. On the south bank, the vast and professional English army was restless. Atop Craig Abbey, the Scottish infantry stood like a silent statue, a wall of spears awaiting sunrise. In the English command pavilion, patience had run out, and arrogance was about to lead to one of the most catastrophic decisions in British military history. The debate was heated. John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, was a veteran soldier. He might be slow and prefer the comfort of barrack, but he was no fool. Looking at the narrow bridge, the marshy terrain beyond it, and the steep hill controlled by the enemy, he saw a tactical nightmare. The bridge was a funnel that would neutralize their greatest advantage: heavy cavalry. The march of the cars would trap his knights in heavy armor, turning them into easy, static targets. The hill gave the Scots the advantage of gravity and momentum. Surrey knew that forcing a crossing there was a terrible risk. He would have argued for a more cautious approach, perhaps a flanking move to find a ford, a shallow crossing point upstream, which would divide the Scots' attention. His advice was reinforced by an unlikely expert. Sir Richard Lundy, a Scottish knight who had surrendered to the English at the capitulation of Irvine, approached Surrey. Knowing both the terrain and the resolve of his countrymen, Lundy offered a sound tactical plan. He volunteered to lead a substantial force of cavalry, perhaps 500 knights, across a nearby ford, supposedly only a few miles upstream. They could cross undetected, bypass Craig Abbey, and attack Wallace and Moray's army from the rear. At the same time, the main Surrey army could begin crossing the bridge. Caught between two attacks, the Scots would be crushed. It was a classic and effective military strategy, but the voice of reason was drowned out by the voice of arrogance. And that voice belonged to Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer. Cressingham was not a soldier. He was an administrator and a clergyman. A man whose worldview was defined by ledgers and the contempt he felt for the Scots, who had deprived him of the king's tax revenue. To him, Surrey's caution was senility, and Lundy's plan was a waste of time, and worse, of money. He saw the army on the hill not as soldiers, but as a disorganized rabble, the scum he so despised. The chronicles capture the essence of his impatience. Cressingham is said to have stood up and publicly reprimanded Surrey. "Why do we prolong this war, my lord, and waste the king's treasury?" he is said to have mocked. "There is no need for tactics or dragging this matter out. Let us advance at once, as is our duty, and finish off this rabble. For Cressingham, every hour spent in maneuvers was more money lost. The idea that this mob of commoners could withstand England's elite cavalry was, to him, unthinkable. The Earl of Surrey, an elderly man suffering from gout and now publicly challenged in his authority, encouraged by a low-born accountant, found himself in an untenable position. Giving in to caution would be seen as weakness or cowardice, a stain on his long military career. Goaded by Cressingham's impatience and fatally underestimating the discipline and leadership of Wallace and Moray, Surrey made the mistake that would define his legacy. He yielded. Against his better judgment, he gave the order to advance. The decision had been made. The trumpet sounded. The English army, in all its glory and might, began to move, but not in a wide battlefront, rather in a terribly thin line. The armored knights, followed by the Welsh and English infantry, began the long, slow procession across the narrow wooden bridge. Leading the vanguard, eager to claim the glory of the victory he considered certain, was Hugh de Cressingham himself. At the top of the hill, Wallace and Moray watched in tense silence. The trap was set. English arrogance, personified by the impatient treasurer, was doing exactly what they expected, delivering the enemy vanguard piece by piece into the swamp they had chosen as their killing field. Scottish patience was about to be rewarded. The die was cast. Under a gray and indifferent September sky, the flower of English cavalry, followed by Welsh and English infantry, began its slow and fateful procession. Stirling's wooden bridge, so narrow that chroniclers claim only 2 knights could pass side by side, became the bottleneck that would seal their fate. The crossing was agonizingly slow. Each warhorse, each man in armor, had to pass in a meticulous and vulnerable file. On the south bank, the Earl of Surrey watched, perhaps with a knot of apprehension in his veteran stomach. On the north bank, the impatient Hugh de Cressingham, leading the vanguard, finally set foot on enemy territory, eager to form his lines and begin the massacre he had foreseen. At the top of Craig Abbey, the Scottish army watched in a silence that was, in itself, a weapon. This was the ultimate test of William Wallace and Andrew Moray's leadership. It wasn't about courage to attack, but courage to wait. Each soldier there, heart pounding in his chest, longed to descend the hill. But the order did not come. They watched as 1,000 Englishmen crossed. The order did not come. They watched as 2,000 crossed, the vanguard slowly unfolding on the marshy plain below, their heavy horses already struggling against the soft terrain of the cars. The order still did not come. The discipline that Wallace and Moray had instilled in their mongrel army was extraordinary. They waited, with predatory patience, while the English vanguard deepened into the trap. The line of soldiers crossing the bridge was the army's umbilical cord. The mass of men forming in the swamp was the prize. Wallace and Moray needed to wait until the number of Englishmen on the north bank was large enough for a decisive victory, but small enough that they could not form a defensive battle line before the Scots reached them. They waited until, by estimates, more than 5,000 English soldiers, including most of the elite heavy cavalry, were trapped in the bend of the river. The bridge behind them was now choked with advancing reinforcements, and the south bank, where Surrey and the rest of the army watched, was too far away to help. So at that moment of perfect balance, when the English vanguard was most vulnerable, disorganized, trapped in the swamp, and with its escape route blocked by its own reinforcements, the order was given. Whether it was a shout from Wallace, a signal from Moray, or the deafening sound of a war horn, it is unknown whether the effect was like a dam breaking. The silence in Craig Abbey exploded into a wild, unified roar. The Scottish army, which had seemed like a statue, became an avalanche. They did not march, they plummeted downhill. Using gravity as their ally, the schiltrons, the infantry formations armed with 12-foot-long spears, gained terrifying momentum. They did not rush as individuals, but as a wall of steel and wood, a giant porcupine rolling downhill. The Scottish attack was a masterpiece of two-front tactics. The main body of the army, led by Wallace, smashed directly against the disorganized English vanguard. The English cavalry, the most feared shock force in Europe, found themselves powerless. Their horses, bogged down in the swamp, could not find firm ground for a charge. The long lances of the Scots struck the horses' chests before the knights could use their swords. The cavalry, deprived of its momentum, became a collection of armored and static targets. The Welsh infantry, trapped between the panicked horses and the approaching wall of lances, was instantly decimated. Simultaneously with the main attack, a smaller detachment of Scots, running faster and lighter, bypassed the main battle and rushed directly to the most important objective on the field, the north end of the bridge. They seized the bridge's exit, killing the English who were still crossing it, and effectively closed the trapdoor. Panic gripped the English vanguard. In an instant, they realized their predicament. They were being massacred by a descending force of infantry. Their horses were useless in the swamp. The river lay to one side, and worst of all, their only escape route, the bridge, was now controlled by the enemy. On the south bank, the Earl of Surrey and the rest of the English army watched in abject horror, unable to send reinforcements and powerless to save their comrades. The bridge became a meat grinder, with English soldiers desperately trying to retreat, colliding with advancing reinforcements, all while the Scots at the bridgehead cut them down. Knights in full armor, seeing the bridge lost, tried to swim across the river and were pulled under by the weight of their own steel. The Scottish victory was not merely tactical, it was absolute. The trap had been set. What unfolded on the swampy plain north of Stirling Bridge was not a battle. It was a systematic massacre. The English vanguard, the elite of Edward I's military power, was hopelessly trapped. The Scottish schiltrons, driven by gravity and righteous fury, drove their long ash lances into the chests of the war horses, denying the English cavalry its only trump card, the momentum of the charge. The knights, mired in the mud, became defenseless steel statues, torn from their saddles and killed on the ground. The Welsh infantry, caught between the panicked horses and the wall of lances, was simply swept away. On the south bank, the Earl of Surrey watched in paralyzing shock. The army he commanded, the invincible force of England, was being dismantled before his eyes by a force he despised. Horror turned to panic as he saw the Scots seize the bridgehead, closing the trap. The bridge, now a chaotic mess of men and horses trying to escape, became impassable. Some English knights, in an act of desperation, spurred their horses into the river, only to be pulled under by the weight of their own armor. The water of the Forth turned red. In the midst of this chaos was the man whose arrogance had forced the crossing, Hugh de Cressingham. The treasurer, obese and uncomfortable in his armor, was thrown from his horse. He found no mercy on the riverbanks. To the Scottish soldiers, he was not merely an enemy. He was the symbol of oppression. He was the man who had starved them, who had called them rabble, and who despised them. His death was as brutal as his administration. Scottish chronicles, such as that of Lenorcost, record a particularly grim and symbolic end. He was killed, and his body was flayed. The Scots, in an act of visceral hatred, are said to have divided his skin into small pieces as macabre trophies. The legend popularized by Harry the Blind goes even further, claiming that Cressingham's skin was used to make sword belts, and that Wallace himself took a piece. Although the veracity of this detail is impossible to prove, the sentiment behind it is historically accurate. The hatred for the treasurer was deep and personal. On the south bank, the battle was lost. Surrey's only concern now was to save the remainder of his army and himself. He gave the order that sealed the fate of his vanguard: destroy the bridge. Sir Marmaduke Thwong, a knight who had bravely fought his way back across the bridge, was one of the last to cross. As soon as he was safe, Surrey ordered the bridge to be set on fire and broken, deliberately abandoning thousands of his own men, including Cressingham, to their fate on the north side. It was the final act of a humiliating defeat, an English commander destroying his own escape route to evade an army he considered inferior. The Scottish victory was total. More than 5,000 English soldiers, including hundreds of heavy cavalry, lay dead on Stirling Castle or at the bottom of the river. Scottish losses, by comparison, were remarkably light. The English were not merely defeated, they were annihilated. Surrey, the governor, did not attempt to defend Stirling Castle. He did not attempt to regroup at Lothian. He fled. He mounted his horse and rode as fast as he could south, not stopping until he reached the safety of Berwick-upon-Tweed, leaving all of Scotland behind. The remnants of his army dissolved, fleeing in panic back to the border. News of the Battle of Stirling Bridge echoed like thunder throughout Christendom. An army of commoners and minor nobility, led by two relatively unknown men, had destroyed an elite English force in open field. It was an unprecedented military humiliation for Edward I in one fell swoop. The house of cards of English occupation collapsed. The remaining English garrisons, isolated and terrified, surrendered or fled. Dundee, which was under siege, fell immediately. Within weeks, almost all of Scotland, from south to north, was free from English control for the first time in years. The crushing victory at Stirling Bridge not only avenged the humiliations of Dunbar and the Ragman Roll, it proved to the world, and more importantly to the Scots themselves, that England could be defeated. Scotland was temporarily free, and William Wallace and Andrew Moray were its undisputed masters. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was, without question, the greatest military victory in Scottish history. A professional English army was annihilated, its treasurer flayed, its governor turned into a fugitive, and an entire nation liberated with a single, brilliant tactical stroke. The morale of the Scottish army was sky-high. They had faced the lion and broken it. In the days that followed, as the remaining English castles surrendered and the occupying administration dissolved, Scotland celebrated its two liberators, William Wallace, the avenger of Lanark, and Andrew Moray, the heir of Petty. They had proven that the fusion of the people and the nobility was unstoppable. But victory in such a brutal war rarely comes without a devastating cost. In the midst of triumph, tragedy struck, one that would go almost unnoticed in later legends, but which would have profound and lasting consequences for the future of Scotland. On that day, September 11th, both commanders had fought on the front lines, side by side with their men. William Wallace, with his legendary stature and strength, emerged from the massacre of the Battle of Stirling without a scratch. Andrew Moray, the brilliant strategist and noble leader of the North, was not so fortunate. At some point in the chaos of the fighting, perhaps in the initial charge downhill, or in hand-to-hand combat against bogged-down knights, Moray was gravely wounded. The chronicles of the time are scarce in medical details, but the wound was deep, likely the result of an English sword or lance. Although he survived the day of the battle, he was mortally wounded. Andrew Moray, the man who had liberated the North, who had brought noble legitimacy and formal military organization to Wallace's rebellion, was dying. His death was not immediate. He continued to co-sign documents with Wallace for several weeks after the battle, demonstrating the unity of their command to the end. A famous letter, sent in October 1297 to merchants in Lübeck and Hamburg, Germany, informed them that Scotland was free and open for trade once more, and was sealed in the names of both Andrew Moray and William Wallace, commanders of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland. But their strength was waning. Sometime in November 1297, less than 2 months after the victory he helped orchestrate, Andrew Moray succumbed to his wounds. The nation, barely beginning to savor its freedom, lost one of its pillars. Moray's death is one of the great tragedies and what-ifs of Scottish history. His loss was incalculable. He was the missing link. Moray was a high-ranking nobleman who, unlike Robert Bruce or James Stewart, had risked everything and bled for independence alongside the commoners. He was a proven strategist and a unifying leader. His presence alongside Wallace gave the cause a legitimacy that the high nobility, who despised Wallace as a new man and an Arabist commoner, could not ignore. As long as Moray lived, the alliance between the people and the lesser nobility was cohesive and strong. With his death, William Wallace was left alone. The burden of the nation fell entirely on the shoulders of one man. Wallace was no longer part of a D'Arcy. He was the sole commander, the only visible leader of the resistance. Tragedy forced him out of the battlefield and into the world of politics, a world for which he had neither the training nor the patience. He could no longer be merely the avenger or the guerrilla tactician. He now had to govern a nation, deal with rival clans, administer justice, and most difficult of all, try to command the great earls and barons who saw him not as a leader, but as a glorified servant who had overstepped his place. The death of Andrew Moray was not only the loss of a hero, it was the removal of the bridge that united the two halves of the Scottish resistance. Wallace was triumphant, but also dangerously isolated at the height of his power. In the euphoric aftermath of Stirling Bridge, Scotland breathed the air of freedom for the first time in almost 2 years. Edward I's occupying army was broken and fleeing, and the remaining English garrisons surrendered in rapid succession. But with the tragic death of Andrew Moray, the victorious nation faced an immediate and dangerous power vacuum. Moray, the nobleman, had been the balance to Wallace, the commoner. Together, they were the commanders of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland. Now, only one remained, and he was a man of the minor nobility, a nobody in the eyes of the old and jealous aristocracy. Scotland needed a government, and William Wallace, the undisputed hero of the people, was the only logical choice, but also the most controversial. The high nobility, men like Robert Bruce and James Stuart, who had surrendered shamefully at Irvine, now emerged from their castles, humiliated but still powerful. They viewed Wallace with a mixture of reluctant admiration and deep class contempt. He was upstart and upstart, a man who had usurped their traditional role as leaders of the nation. However, they had no choice. The Scottish army, composed of the men who fought and bled at Stirling, was loyal to a single man, Wallace. To try to remove him would be to start a civil war, a war they would certainly lose. Recognizing this reality, and perhaps driven by true patriots within the church, such as Bishop Robert Wishart of Glasgow, who always played a double game against Edward, a move was made to formalize Wallace's power. In order for him to govern legitimately, negotiate with foreign nations, as he and Moray had already done with Lubeck and Hamburg, and most importantly, command the great feudal lords, he needed a title. He could not remain a mere commander of the army. Sometime in late 1297 or early 1298, probably at a formal ceremony in the Falkirk church in Selkirk, the transformation was completed. First, William Wallace, the minor knight, was formally knighted. This was a symbolic and crucial step. It was likely performed by one of the few earls who had belatedly joined his cause, perhaps Malcolm, Earl of Lennox. This act elevated him, at least in martial status, to the level of the men he would now command. Immediately after being knighted Sir William Wallace, he received the highest title Scotland could offer, Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland. This was not a vague title. It was the same title held by the 6 guardians who ruled after the death of Alexander III. It was the power of a regent, conferring upon Wallace the full authority of a king in all but name. He could now convene parliaments, administer justice, raise taxes, raise armies, and conduct international diplomacy. However, Wallace made a masterful political move, one that demonstrated his shrewdness and his lack of personal ambition for the throne. He did not accept this power in his own name. He was appointed guardian, not by the people or the army, but in the name of the legitimate and exiled king, King John Balliol. This was a brilliant decision. By declaring himself a servant of King John, Wallace transformed his rebellion into a legal war of restoration. He was not a traitor to Edward I. He was a loyal subject fighting to restore his rightful monarch, who had been illegally deposed by the English king. This gave legal cover to his actions and silenced any nobleman, such as Robert Bruce, who had his own claim to the throne, who might accuse him of trying to seize the crown for himself. He would rule Scotland, but the crown would remain symbolically on the head of the pathetic tomb tabard, now a prisoner in the Tower of London. Thus, in a matter of months, William Wallace had risen from a hunted outlaw in Lanark to the de facto ruler of an entire kingdom. He was Sir William Wallace, Guardian of Scotland, Supreme Commander of the army and leader of a free nation. He was at the height of his power, but it was a lonely and precarious height. He did not have the blood of Andrew Moray to appease the nobles. He ruled in the name of a weak king whom no one loved, and he was watched with hatred and jealousy by the earls and barons who obeyed his orders not out of loyalty, but out of fear of the people who adored him. Wallace, the statesman, now faced an even greater challenge than battle, governing a divided nation while the hammer of the Scots prepared, in the south, to deliver a vengeful blow. Sir William Wallace, the newly appointed Guardian of Scotland, was in command of a miraculously liberated but dangerously starving kingdom. The victory at Stirling Bridge in September had been a military triumph, but it had come too late to save the 1297 harvest. Hugh de Cressingham brutal administration and the turmoil of war had devastated the Scottish economy. The army that had joined Wallace and Moray was large, victorious, and now idle. And an idle army needs to be fed. With winter rapidly approaching, the euphoria of freedom was being threatened by the harsh reality of famine. Wallace, a pragmatist forged by guerrilla warfare, knew he couldn't ask an already exhausted peasantry to support his army. The solution wasn't within Scotland's borders, it was to the south. England, the nation that had plundered Scotland, would now pay to sustain it. Wallace's decision wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. Border wars were common, but this wouldn't be a simple cattle raid. The Guardian of Scotland, acting with the full authority of the kingdom, would launch a full-scale invasion of northern England. The objectives were twofold and equally crucial. The first was practical, logistics. The army needed grain, livestock, textiles, and above all, money to pay the soldiers and buy weapons. The northern counties of England, Northumberland, and Cumberland were overflowing with these supplies. The second objective was psychological, morale, and revenge. For years, Scotland had endured the boot of occupation. Now, Wallace would take the war to the enemy's home. He would make the English people feel the same terror the Scots felt at the sack of Berwick. It would be a brutal lesson in retaliation and a way to raise Scottish morale to a feverish level. They were no longer rebels defending their homes. They were conquerors punishing their oppressors. In October 1297, less than a month after the death of Andrew Moray, Wallace mustered his battle-hardened army. This was not the makeshift force that had gathered at Lanark. It was a confident and disciplined war machine that had proven its worth. They crossed the border and descended upon Northumberland like a plague. The English reaction was one of pure panic. The Surrey army had evaporated after Stirling, and Edward I was in Flanders. Northern England was, in effect, defenseless. The local militias, terrified by Wallace's reputation, who was now seen in England as a cannibalistic demon, either disbanded or locked themselves behind the walls of castles like Alnwick and Warwick. The Scottish army swept across the field in what was known as Ride, a scorched earth tactic designed to destroy the enemy's economy and morale. Villages were burned, mansions were looted, and vast herds of cattle and sheep were rounded up and sent north. The fury of the Scottish soldiers, remembering Berwick and Dunbar, was immense. Wallace himself, though ruthless in war, demonstrated that his target was Edward's infrastructure, not necessarily the innocent. A famous story, recorded in the Lenorcost Chronicle, an English source, which makes it all the more remarkable, recounts that Wallace intervened to protect the monks of Hexham Abbey, while his men looted. Wallace is said to have ordered that the monks themselves be spared, granting them protection, and even attending Mass while the pillaging occurred around them. A gesture that showed his religious devotion, but also his absolute authority over his men. The invasion lasted for weeks, stretching into November. The Scottish army moved with impunity, reportedly reaching as far as the outskirts of Newcastle. Wallace, the outlaw of Lanark, now sat on English soil as a conquering warlord, making terms and collecting the blood and treasure tribute of the most powerful nation in Europe. For Edward I in Flanders, the news was more than a military defeat. It was an unbearable personal humiliation. A Scottish thief was not only ruling Scotland in Baliol's name, he was now burning the villages of Founwador. When the first severe frost of winter finally forced the Scottish army to retreat, they returned to Scotland not as rebels, but as suppliers. They brought with them a supply train so vast that it ensured the survival of Scotland and its army throughout the winter of 1297 to 1298. Morale was at its peak. Wallace was no longer just the Guardian. He was the man who had liberated Scotland, defeated the English, and then plundered England to feed his people. He seemed invincible. But this invasion, while a spectacular logistical and moral success, also sealed his fate. He had personally humiliated Edward I. The Hammer of the Scots would now abandon his war in France, not out of duty, but out of cold, utter vengeance. He would return to England with a single purpose, to find William Wallace and destroy him. While William Wallace spent the winter of 1297 to 1298 at Stirling Castle, governing as Guardian of Scotland and receiving the praise of his people in Flanders, his mortal enemy finally grasped the scale of the disaster. King Edward I, Longshanks, received not just news. He received the Earl of Surrey himself, a defeated and humiliated commander, fleeing for his life. Added to this was the news of the horrific death of his treasurer, Hugh of Cressingham, and the final insult, Wallace's audacious invasion of northern England. For Edward, a monarch who saw himself as the epitome of chivalrous royalty and military might, this was unbearable. The humiliation of Stirling was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a personal affront from a nobody, ignoble, who dared to defy an anointed king. Edward I's rage was legendary. It was said that his temper was so volatile that servants sometimes died of fright in his presence. Now, that rage was focused on a single goal: the annihilation of William Wallace and the total subjugation of Scotland. He immediately ended his campaign in Flanders, signing a hasty truce with King Philip IV of France. His Continental War, which had been his priority, was now a distraction. The real war, the war for his honor, was in the north. In March 1298, Edward I landed in England and began preparing the largest invasion Britain had ever seen. He wasn't just assembling an army, he was summoning a force of vengeance. The professionalism, scale, and logistics of this new campaign would eclipse anything Scotland had ever faced. Edward emptied his coffers, summoned his barons, and called upon all vassals who owed him military service. He wasn't just bringing soldiers, he was bringing specialists. From his campaigns in Wales, he brought back thousands of archers from South Wales, men who had perfected the use of a weapon that would change history, the longbow. This was not the short bow used for hunting. It was a 6-foot-long weapon, made of yew, with immense pulling power, capable of firing a goose arrow with enough force to pierce a knight's chainmail armor from 200 yards away. In the hands of trained archers, they could fire up to 12 arrows per minute, creating a storm of steel that could destroy entire armies before they even got to close combat. In addition to the archers, Edward summoned the heart of his might, his heavy cavalry. More than 2,500 armored knights, the largest cavalry force ever assembled on British soil, answered the call. These were the same types of knights defeated at Stirling, but this time they would be led not by an impatient bureaucrat, but by the king himself, the most experienced military commander in Europe. The infantry consisted of tens of thousands of English, Welsh, and even Irish and Gascon mercenary soldiers. In total, it was an overwhelming force of perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 men, including a vast supply train and siege equipment. This was not the compliant force of Surrey. This was the hammer of the Scots himself. Edward moved his capital and his government temporarily to York, transforming northern England into a vast military staging ground. He was methodically cutting off any support for Wallace. He pressured Pope Boniface VIII, who, under Edward's influence, issued a papal bull condemning Scottish resistance and excommunicating its leaders, a devastating psychological weapon in an age of faith. While Edward gathered his forces in York, Wallace's political situation in Scotland began to deteriorate. The unity forged at Stirling was breaking down. The great nobles, such as Robert Bruce and the Earl of Buchan, resented Wallace's authority. They obeyed him reluctantly, and his refusal to fully commit his own feudal armies to national defense weakened Wallace's power. The Guardian, who depended on his popularity and the commoner infantry, now found himself having to command an aristocracy that secretly despised him and awaited his downfall. In June 1298, Edward's army was ready. On July 3rd, they crossed the border at Roxburgh. The invasion had begun. Wallace, aware that he could not face this force in open field, especially not without the full support of the Scottish noble cavalry, implemented the only strategy that could work: a scorched earth policy. He ordered the entire south of Scotland to be emptied. Cattle were driven north, grain was burned in the fields, and villages were abandoned. Wallace's strategy was simple: let Edward I's army march across a desolate land. Such a large army needed a huge amount of food, and if Wallace could deny it, starvation would do the work that Scottish spears could not. Scotland held its breath as the largest army in its history retreated, drawing the English lion into the heart of an empty kingdom. The final confrontation was inevitable. As Edward I's colossal army advanced like a slow, devouring tide through southern Scotland, William Wallace, the Guardian, knew that his scorched earth policy was merely a delaying tactic. Sooner or later, the brute force of the English invasion would have to be met on a battlefield. Wallace's strategy of starvation was brilliant. The English army was indeed suffering, with low morale and hunger corroding its ranks. However, the Guardian could not simply allow the English king to march unopposed to Stirling. He would have to stop and fight. But how? The Battle of Stirling Bridge, his greatest victory, had been a miracle of geography. Wallace and Moray had used a narrow bridge and a swamp to neutralize Edward's deadliest weapon, heavy cavalry. Now, in open field, that tactical advantage did not exist. Wallace would face the full power of thousands of armored knights on firm ground. For any medieval commander, the sight of a heavy cavalry charge was the end of the battle. The infantry, however brave, would inevitably break and flee before that thunder of steel and flesh. Wallace, however, was not a conventional commander. He did not come from the feudal school that idolized the cavalry charge. His confidence lay in the force that had led him to victory, the common man, the plebeian, armed with the simplest and most effective weapon of the time, the lance. But he knew that traditional lance formations, arranged in straight lines, could be flanked and broken. He needed something impenetrable, a formation that could withstand a cavalry charge coming from any direction. The solution was the schiltron. This word, of uncertain origin possibly meaning shield wall or dense formation, became the name of the tactic that Wallace would perfect and that would define Scottish warfare for a century. The idea was not entirely new. The Greeks had their phalanxes, and the Flemish used similar pike formations. But Wallace adapted it to the Scottish terrain and to the specific threat of English cavalry. The schiltron was, in essence, a human porcupine. It was a static defensive formation, usually circular or hollow square-shaped, composed of hundreds, sometimes thousands of infantry soldiers. These were not peasants with pitchforks. They were trained men, equipped with ash spears 12 to 15 feet, about 4 meters long. The men in the first rank knelt, planting the base of their spears in the ground, with the steel point facing outwards at the height of a horse's chest. The ranks behind them held their spears at progressively higher angles, creating a dense and impenetrable forest of spear points. The formation was compact, shoulder to shoulder, so that there were no gaps for a horse to exploit. For the English cavalry, the schiltron was a tactical nightmare. The charge, which relied on momentum and shock to break enemy lines, was useless against it. A knight, however brave, could not force his horse to impale itself on a solid wall of sharp steel. The charge would inevitably stop before impact, leaving the knights frustrated and vulnerable, trapped a short distance away, while Scottish lancers could prod and wound the horses from below. Wallace trained his army of commoners, the common men who had fought at Stirling, to maintain this formation with iron discipline. Their lives depended on it. The schiltron's motto was simple: hold the line. As long as the formation remained intact, they were invincible against cavalry. If the formation broke, if a single man ran, a gap would open and the cavalry would rush in, massacring the formation from within. It was a tactic that demanded immense courage, mutual trust, and absolute faith in their leader. There was, however, a fatal weakness. The schiltron was a defensive, almost static formation. It was an anvil, not a hammer. Its men, burdened with long spears and trapped in a dense formation, could barely move. They could withstand a charge, but they couldn't advance quickly or maneuver. And most dangerous of all, they were a large, slow, and densely packed target. If the enemy had a way to attack them from a distance before hand-to-hand combat even began, the schiltron could be decimated without ever having a chance to fight. When Wallace finally chose his terrain to confront Edward I near the city of Falkirk, he based his entire battle strategy on this single tactic. He would position his schiltrons on a hill, use makeshift palisades to protect them, and wait for Edward's cavalry to break against his wall of spears, just as he had done at Stirling. He was relying on the courage of his commoner spearmen. What he did not foresee was that Edward I did not plan to use his cavalry first. He planned to use the other weapon he had brought, the Welsh archers and their longbows. William Wallace's scorched earth strategy was working with devastating effectiveness. In July 1298, Edward I's vast army was bogged down near Kirkliston, not far from Edinburgh, and was starving. Supply ships that were supposed to resupply them at Leith were delayed by contrary winds. English morale plummeted. Welsh soldiers, hungry and weary of their English master's war, went on a drunken rampage, killing several English clergymen before Edward's cavalry mowed them down in the streets. The army was on the verge of collapse. Edward, himself, was struck in the chest by his startled warhorse during the night, breaking several ribs. Wounded, starving, and with his army disintegrating, the Hammer of Scots was about to admit defeat. He gave the bitter order: retreat to Edinburgh and abandon the campaign. It was at this very moment, the lowest point of the invasion, that fate intervened. On the morning the English army began to break camp for retreat, 2 Scottish knights arrived at Edward's pavilion. They were Patrick, Earl of Dunbar, and Gilbert, Earl of Angus. These were great Scottish feudal lords who, Either out of fear of losing their lands or out of genuine contempt for Wallace's commoner rule, had chosen the side of England. They brought Edward the information for which he would sacrifice everything. William Wallace and his entire army were encamped just 30 kilometers away, near Falkirk in Calendar Forest, apparently ready to attack the rear of the retreating English army. The news struck like lightning for the wounded king. The pain, the hunger, and the mutiny were forgotten. Revenge was within his grasp. It is said that Edward exclaimed, "Thank God, at least they brought me my enemy." He immediately canceled the order to retreat. Instead, he ordered a forced night march. The English army, invigorated by the promise of battle, marched all night, with the wounded king leading them. At dawn on July 22, 1298, they reached a hill and saw, in the valley below, the Scottish army hastily forming for battle. Wallace had been caught by surprise. He had expected to attack a retreating army, not face an entire army ready for war. Wallace, the Guardian, had nowhere else to run. He had neither Stirling Bridge nor the swamp. He had only a gentle slope, Calendar Slope, and the courage of his men. He deployed his army with the only tactic that could save them. He divided his precious spear infantry, the heart of his army, into 4 enormous circular formations, the Great Schiltrons. These were 4 human porcupines, each with perhaps 2,000 men, arranged in a field to receive the incoming charge. Between each Schiltron, he positioned his archers from Ettrick Forest, loyal and deadly men with their short bows, protecting them with an improvised fence of sharpened stakes. In the rear, far behind the infantry, he positioned what remained of Scottish might, the noble cavalry. This small contingent of perhaps 1,000 knights was led by some of the most powerful men in Scotland, including Sir John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, a longtime rival of Robert Bruce, and a man who despised Wallace. The Battle of Falkirk began with the thunder of vengeance. The English heavy cavalry, led by the proud Earls of Lincoln, Hereford, and Norfolk, did not wait for infantry or archers. They had a score to settle, since the humiliation at Stirling. They split into 2 massive waves and advanced uphill, directly against the Schiltrons. The first attack was chaotic. Lincoln's cavalry, unaware of a small swamp in the path, had to veer off course, while Hereford's wave charged straight ahead. They struck the Scots with the force of an earthquake. The first casualties were the light infantry. Wallace's archers, protected only by flimsy stakes, were simply swept away, crushed under the hooves of 1,000 warhorses. But then, the cavalry hit the walls with spears. Wallace's tactic worked. The Schiltrons held firm. The discipline of the commoner infantry was ironclad. Just as the Guardian had trained, they planted their lances and became impenetrable. The most powerful cavalry charge in Christendom stopped dead. Impaled horses neighed. Knights were brought down, and the tide of English steel retreated in disarray down the hill, leaving hundreds dead around the Scottish formations. For a moment, it seemed that the miracle of Stirling might be repeated. The Schiltrons were intact, undefeated. Wallace and his commoner lancers had withstood the first and most fearsome attack. Now was the time for the Scottish cavalry, held in reserve, to advance and attack the disorderly English knights. Wallace looked back, expecting to see Comyn's standards advancing, but the ridge where the cavalry should have been was empty. The crucial moment of the Battle of Falkirk hung suspended in time. The largest cavalry force in Christendom had advanced uphill and broken in bloody chaos against the walls of lances of William Wallace's commoner Schiltrons. The English momentum was spent. Their knights were disordered, their horses wounded and panicked. It was the perfect moment for a counterattack. A charge by the Scottish cavalry, held in reserve, against the now vulnerable English knights, could have turned a successful defense into a decisive defeat for Edward I Wallace. Amidst his victorious lancers, looked to the rear, to the ridge where the 1,000 knights of the Scottish nobility were positioned. He saw nothing. The summit was empty. The Scottish cavalry, led by figures like Sir John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, had vanished. They had fled the battlefield without striking a single blow. This act, the flight of the nobility from Falkirk, is one of the darkest and most debated events in Scottish history. For pro-Wallace chroniclers and the legend that followed, it was an act of cowardly and premeditated betrayal. The narrative is simple and damning. The nobles, like the Comyns, who possessed their own distant claim to the throne and viewed Wallace with class jealousy and contempt, never intended to fight. They saw Wallace as a greater danger to their own social order than Edward I himself. They would have led their armies to Falkirk merely as a demonstration, deliberately abandoning the commoner Shiltrans to their fate the moment the battle began. In this version of the story, John Cumeen is the aristocratic villain who, out of envy, sacrificed the Scottish army to ensure the downfall of his commoner rival. However, history is rarely that simple. Modern historians offer a more tactical and less melodramatic perspective, although the end result remains the same. The Scottish cavalry was a small force, perhaps 1,000 knights at most. They were not just cavalry, they wereth nobility, the earls, barons, and knights who owned land. That morning they looked down the hill and saw not only the 1,000 English knights who had just been repelled, they saw the Socon Dantheardways of the English attack were forming. They saw Edward I himself, the greatest military commander of the time, organizing his thousands of infantry soldiers and, most importantly, his thousands of Welsh archers. From a purely military perspective, the Scottish cavalry's position was untenable. They were terribly outnumbered, perhaps 3-1 in terms of cavalry. A charge against Edward's main force would have been suicide. What they saw, more pragmatically, was a battle that was already lost. They may have argued that preserving themselves, the feudal and military leadership of Scotland, was more important in the long run than dying in a futile gesture alongside Wallace's infantry. If the leaders died there, the Scottish resistance would die with them. Therefore, the flight may not have been treachery, but a brutally pragmatic tactical retreat. A third theory, even more charitable towards the nobles, is that they simply panicked. When they saw Wallace's archers, who were positioned between the Shiltrans, being instantly annihilated by the first charge of the English cavalry, may have assumed that the battle was lost and that the Shiltrans would be next. But whatever the motivation, premeditated betrayal, pragmatic tactical retreat, or sheer cowardice, the effect on the battlefield was the same. Wallace's army was abandoned. His flanks, which should have been protected by cavalry, were now completely exposed. The Shiltrans, the impenetrable porcupines, were alone on the field, victorious but terribly isolated. They were an anvil without a hammer. They had proven they could withstand cavalry, but now they had no way to attack, nor to defend themselves from what was to come. King Edward I, watching the Scottish cavalry flee, now knew the battle was his. He had Wallace and his commoner infantry trapped. He didn't even need to risk his knights again. He simply turned to his trump card, the Welsh archers. King Edward I observed the battlefield with the cold appreciation of a master craftsman. His elite cavalry, Christendom's proudest shock weapon, had been repelled and humiliated by the plebeian discipline of the Shiltrans. The noble Scottish cavalry, Wallace's only mobile asset, had fled, abandoning its infantry. The battlefield was at a tense stalemate. Wallace's Shiltrans were victorious but static, rooted in the hill like 4 great steel oaks. They had proven they could withstand the charge, but now they were trapped, unable to advance, and without cavalry protection. For a lesser commander, this would be a dilemma. For Edward I, Longshanks was the moment the battle was won. Didn't need his cavalry to break the Shiltrans. He had a new weapon, one he himself had perfected in the brutal wars against the Welsh, and ironically, he would use it on the very men who had taught him how to use it. He turned to his battalions of archers. They numbered in the thousands, many of them from South Wales, recruited from counties like Gwent, where the use of the longbow was second nature. This was not the short bow used for hunting or in the skirmishes of Wallace's Ettrick Forest archers, who had already been annihilated by cavalry. The English longbow was a revolutionary piece of military technology. It was a personal weapon with the power of artillery. Made from a single yew-rod, often over 6 feet tall, it required immense pulling force, which deformed the skeletons of archers who used it from childhood. Its arrows, with bodkin steel tips designed for piercing, could be fired with lethal accuracy over 200 meters, and in volleys, could travel almost 300. They could pierce chainmail, and, in some cases, even the finest plate armor. Edward I did not order another cavalry charge. He ordered his knights to withdraw to a safe distance. He then gave the order for his Welsh and English archers to advance to the flanks of the now exposed Shiltrans. The archer commanders gave their orders. Thousands of bows were raised simultaneously, and then the sky over Falkirk darkened. What followed was hell on earth. Edward's archers began firing in controlled volleys. The sound was like a sudden, violent storm. the whizzing of tens of thousands of goose-feathered arrows rising in a high arc before falling almost vertically onto the Scottish formations. For the men in the schiltrons, there was no defense. Their formation, their only salvation against the horses, was now their death sentence. They were huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, in dense circles. Every arrow that fell was almost guaranteed to find a human target. Their shields, if they had any, were designed to deflect sword blows, not to block a storm of steel coming from above. Their Potts metal helmets could deflect some blows, but most wore only leather caps or nothing at all. Arrows pierced shoulders, thighs, and necks. The men in the front row kneeling were easy targets. The men in the back rows exposed to the sky were too. The iron discipline that had withstood the cavalry began to falter under an agony they could not fight back against. They could not run. Breaking formation meant instant death at the hands of the English cavalry, which now circled like sharks, waiting for an opening. They could not advance. The formation was too slow and cumbersome, and they could not hide. They had nothing to do but stand still, keep their lances pointed at an enemy that would not come, and die where they were. The storm of steel was relentless. The Welsh archers could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With thousands of archers on the field, it was a continuous rain of death. The schiltrons began to disintegrate, not from an attack but from sheer erosion. Men screamed and fell, creating holes in the wall of spears. The living had to trample over the dead and dying to try to close the ranks. Morale broke. Courage could not stop the arrows. The impenetrable porcupines were being skinned alive from a distance. When Edward I saw the Scottish formations finally falter, become ragged, and the gaps become too large to fill, he gave the signal. The storm of steel ceased, and then he unleashed his cavalry to final blow. This time the knights did not encounter a wall of spears. They encountered broken formations of terrified, dying, and demoralized men. The English knights advanced into the gaps, their longswords finally able to reach the spearmen. The massacre was total. The schiltrons, Wallace's great innovation, were destroyed by an even greater innovation. The Battle of Falkirk was lost, not by the English cavalry, but by the devastating power of the Welsh longbow. The Battle of Falkirk had turned into a slaughterhouse. The schiltrons, William Wallace's great anvil, had been systematically broken, not by the hammer of the cavalry, but by the rain of steel from the Welsh longbows. Now, with the formations broken, the English heavy cavalry, led by King Edward I himself, finally had their revenge for Stirling. They advanced into the gaps, their longswords and battle-axes rising and falling, cutting down the Scottish lancers who, even amidst the annihilation, refused to surrender. The discipline that had made them invincible now only ensured that they died where they stood. For William Wallace, trapped amidst one of his collapsing schiltrons, the moment was one of agony and clarity. His strategy had failed. His reliance on the common infantry had been justified, but his underestimation of longbow technology and, more bitterly, his confidence in the loyalty of the noble cavalry had been a fatal error. The battlefield was no longer a contest of tactics. It was an exercise in extermination. Around him, his most loyal friends, the men who had been with him since his guerrilla days, were falling. Sir John the Graham, his closest friend and most trusted lieutenant, described by chroniclers as strong, wise, and brave, was killed in the desperate fighting. The loss of Graham was, for Wallace, as profound a blow as the loss of the battle itself. Stirling's army, the proud force that had liberated Scotland, was being methodically wiped out on the slopes of Callandor. The defeat was absolute, but honor was preserved in the spilled blood. The Scottish lancers did not flee. They fought to the end, selling their lives dearly and earning the reluctant respect even of the English chroniclers. But courage could not reverse the disaster. With the army disintegrating and Wallace himself at risk of capture, a prize Edward I desired above all else, the Guardian had to make the most difficult decision of his life. He could not win. He could not die there, for his capture or death would mean the symbolic end of the resistance. He had to flee. Leading a small contingent of his surviving personal knights and a few of his men-at-arms, Wallace fought his way out of the chaos. He did not flee, as the nobles had done initially, but retreated like a defeated commander, covered in blood and dust, leaving behind the bodies of thousands of loyal men, including his best friend. He fled to the safety of Callandor Forest, the same forest where he had camped the previous night, a guardian in command of an army. Now he was just a hunted man once more. He had narrowly escaped the clutches of Edward I, but the price of his life was his army and his nation. The Battle of Falkirk was a grim mirror image of Stirling. Wallace's victory at Stirling gave him Scotland. His defeat at Falkirk took it from him. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Wallace's army was not merely defeated, it had ceased to exist. The backbone of the commoner infantry was broken, and the nation's morale, which had been at its peak, plummeted. Edward I was the undisputed master of the field. The military defeat quickly turned into political collapse. Wallace, the commoner, had received the title of guardian for one thing only: success. He was the charismatic leader who could win. Now, he was the leader who had presided over the greatest military defeat in Scottish history. The high nobility, the men who had abandoned him on the battlefield, were now re-emerging. They could no longer be commanded by a man whose military authority was in tatters. Clashed jealousy, resentment, and political rivalry, which had been suppressed by Stirling's victory, exploded. Sometime in the dark months following Falkirk, likely at a tense meeting of the surviving nobility, William Wallace made his final act as leader of the nation. He relinquished the title of Guardian of Scotland. He wasn't deposed in a coup. He surrendered the seal of office, acknowledging that his name no longer united the nation. Scotland needed leaders whom the nobles would follow. The title of Guardian was passed, ironically, to the two men who represented the factions that had undermined him: Sir John Comyn the Red, the same man who may have betrayed him at Falkirk, and Robert the Bruce, Earl of Carrick, the young nobleman who claimed the throne and had played both sides. Wallace's era as Scotland's anointed leader had ended, not with applause, but with the bitter silence of defeat. He was, once again, simply William Wallace, the outlaw. After the Battle of Falkirk and his resignation as guardian, William Wallace disappears from the official records of history. The man who had been the de facto ruler of Scotland, whose name was proclaimed in proclamations and letters to foreign kings, vanished. He became a ghost, a whisper. But for Edward I, he was an obsession. The hammer of Scots may have broken Wallace's army, but the man, the symbol, had escaped. And as long as Wallace lived, the conquest of Scotland would never be complete. Thus begins the long hunt. The years from 1298 to 1305 are not a chapter of battles, but a long and desperate game of survival. The scene shifts from grand tapestries of marching armies to claustrophobic close-ups of a man fleeing. We see a Scotland now being systematically subjugated by Edward I, who rebuilds castles and installs new garrisons. Official resistance continues under the new guardians, Comyn and Bruce, but it is a war of nobles, full of truces and politics. Wallace's war, the People's War, has returned to the shadows. These are the lost years, the years in which the legend was forged in desperation. He was the king of outlaws, as the English mockingly called him. Every English sheriff in Scotland, every Scottish nobleman who sought Edward's favor, hunted him. He could trust no one except a tiny circle of followers who worshipped him like a saint. He moved from hideout to hideout: Ettrick Forest, the marshes of Ayrshire, the hills of Clydesdale. Each sunrise was a victory, each sunset a renewed danger. Meanwhile, the outside world moved on. The new guardians, Bruce and Comyn, fought amongst themselves as much as they fought the English. Edward I returned year after year, his campaign of conquest slow but inexorable. Castles fell, nobles surrendered. In 1304, official resistance crumbled. Robert the Bruce submitted to Edward, and Sir John Comyn signed the Treaty of Strathord, a formal surrender of almost the entire nation. Scotland was, once again, conquered. Edward I was now master of all, except one man. Only William Wallace, the last outlaw, the only man who never bowed down, remained. He was specifically excluded from all pardons. Edward's order was simple. Wallace was to be hunted everywhere and by every means and delivered to the king's justice. The hunt, which had lasted for years, now intensified. The net was closing. It was no longer a matter off with Wallace would be caught, but when and most importantly by whom. While William Wallace disappeared into the mists of Scotland as a hunted outlaw, another narrative about his lost years, approximately 1299 to 1303, emerged. This is not a story of desperate survival in caves and forests, but rather one of high-stakes diplomacy in the corridors of European power. This version, though lacking detailed corroboration, is supported by tantalizing fragments of evidence and is crucial to understanding Wallace's international reputation. After resigning as guardian, Wallace, the fallen military leader, seemingly transformed into Wallace, the diplomatic envoy. He recognized that Scotland, exhausted by famine and crushed by Edward's military might, could not win with spears alone. It needed allies. And so he embarked on a perilous mission to the continent with two main objectives: France and the papacy. The first destination was Paris, the court of King Philip IV. The motive was clear: to invoke the Auld Alliance. This pact, signed by John Balliol in 1295, was a treaty of mutual defense against England. Wallace, still acting as a loyal servant of the exiled King John, would argue that now was the time for France to honor its commitment. A French intervention, or even substantial funding, could turn the tide. More pragmatically, Wallace would offer Philip a second front by keeping Edward I occupied in Scotland. Philip gained a crucial advantage in his own war against Edward in Gascony. Harry the Blind's poem, naturally, transforms this journey into a swashbuckling romance, with Wallace battling the dreaded pirate Red Rover on the way to France. The reality, though less fantastical, was equally dangerous. The second and most important destination was Rome, the seat of Christendom's spiritual power. The objective was to find Pope Boniface VIII. This was a mission of desperation and legal genius. Edward I had won the propaganda war, portraying Wallace and the Scots as barbaric rebels who had betrayed their feudal overlord. The Pope, believing Edward had supported the English cause and excommunicated the Scottish resistance. Wallace's mission was to bypass the kings and appeal directly to the highest court in the world. He would argue, like a lawyer, that Scotland was not a fiefdom of England, but a sovereign and independent kingdom, a special child of Rome. He would present proof of Edward's brutality, the sack of Berwick, and the unlawful deposition of King John. He would seek the impossible, that the Pope would annul the excommunication, condemn Edward I, and recognize the legitimacy of Scotland's War of Independence. For centuries, these voyages were considered pure legend, inventions of Harry the Blind. Then, N.E. Balujo, a single, extraordinary piece of evidence was discovered in the archives of the Tower of London, where it was ironically preserved by the very English who executed him. It is a letter of safe conduct, dated November 7, 1300, from King Philip IV of France. In the letter, the French king commands his agents in Rome to provide all possible assistance to our beloved William Wallace, knight in his business to be conducted with our Lord the Pope. This document is explosive. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Wallace wasn't just hiding in the Highlands. He was in France. He had met with King Philip IV, and he was, with the support of the French king, on his way to Rome for a papal audience. This transforms Wallace's image from that of a simple barbarian warrior into that of a statesman and international diplomat, recognized as a knight by one of the great powers of Europe. Unfortunately, the mission was ultimately a political failure. Pope Boniface VIII, although he issued some bulls such as the, son, those who questioned Edward's claims were pragmatic politicians, and ultimately, his own conflict with Philip IV made him more dependent on the goodwill of England. Even more devastating, in 1303, France and England signed the Treaty of Paris. King Philip IV, to secure his own interests in Gascony, made peace with Edward I and, in the process, formally abandoned Scotland. The Auld Alliance was dead. Wallace, the diplomat, had failed. International support would not come. He was now trapped on the continent, a man whose cause had been betrayed by his allies. With no options left, and with Scotland now under Edward's almost complete control after Cummin's surrender in 1304, Wallace made his final decision. He would not remain in exile. If he could not save Scotland through diplomacy, he would return to die with it, or at least, to fight once more as an outlaw. The year 1303 was a year of betrayals and collapse. On the continent, William Wallace's diplomatic mission, his last hope of saving Scotland through politics, crumbled to ashes. King Philip IV of France, in whom the Auld Alliance placed its faith, made peace with Edward I in the Treaty of Paris to secure his own interests in Gascony. Philip abandoned the Scots to their fate. The Auld Alliance was dead, and Wallace, the diplomatic envoy, was now a man without allies and without purpose on the continent. While Wallace was isolated in France, Edward I, free from his continental war, launched his most devastating and final invasion of Scotland. This was a campaign of total conquest, a war machine that advanced inexorably through the country. In February 1304, the last organized resistance of the Scottish nobility, led by Guardian John the Red Cummin, finally yielded. In the Treaty of Strathord, Cummin and the overwhelming majority of the surviving Scottish nobles formally surrendered to Edward I. They gave up castles, swore allegiance, and were accepted back into the king's favor, albeit with heavy fines. Even the young Robert the Bruce, who had played both sides, had already made peace with Edward. Scotland was, for the second time, pacified. The entire country was under English rule, from the castles to the earls. It was to this scene of total submission that William Wallace returned. His return to Scotland, probably sometime in late 1304, was not a triumphant landing. It was the secret slip of a ghost into his own grave. He no longer had an army. He no longer had a title. The nobles who had abandoned him at Falkirk now served his enemy. The nation for which he had fought seemed to have given up on itself. To any rational man, the war was over. But Wallace was not a rational man. He was a man of principle. If the nobility had surrendered, he would not. If France had betrayed him, he would trust in his own sword. If Scotland was officially dead, he would be the living memory of its freedom. His return was the embodiment of his old motto: freedom is the best of things. Freedom is the best of all things. He would rather die as a free outlaw in his own land than live as a pardoned nobleman in exile. Immediately, he returned to what he did best. He returned to the shadows. He went back to his old haunts, the dense forests of Ettrick and Selkirk, the marshes of Ayrshire, and the valleys of Clydesdale, where his rebellion had begun. He no longer led a national army, he led a band. He was joined by the irreconcilable, men who had lost everything, lesser knights who refused to bow down, and perhaps even clergymen who preached holy war. This was not a campaign to recapture Stirling or Edinburgh. It was a war of vengeance and symbols. Wallace resumed guerrilla warfare with desperate ferocity. He knew he couldn't defeat Edward I, but he could make the English king bleed. He could turn Edward's peace into hell for the English administrators. He and his men hunted down English patrols, ambushed supply convoys, and executed sheriffs and tax collectors appointed by the English. He became the terror of occupied Scotland, a constant and irritating reminder that Edward's conquest was not total. For Edward I, this situation was exasperating. He had conquered the kingdom, received the submission of its natural leaders, the Bruces, the Cummins, the Stuarts. He was in the process of drafting an ordinance for the new government of Scotland, fully integrating it into England. And yet, this ignoblethous low-born thief still defied the king's will. Wallace's continued resistance was more than a military nuisance. It was a political humiliation. It exposed the lie of Edward's peace and gave hope to the subjugated. As long as Wallace lived, Scotland was not truly conquered. Thus, Wallace, the lone man, became the #1 target of the entire English state apparatus. His struggle was no longer for victory, but for the very soul of the nation. He was the only flame that still burned in a dark kingdom. In 1304, King Edward I of England could rightly believe he had finally won. Scotland was broken. His military campaign had been a triumph of logistics and brute force. The mighty Stirling Castle, the last great stronghold to resist, fell after a devastating siege where Edward used his new and terrifying siege engines, including the Warwolf, a giant trebuchet that demolished walls. After this fall, the organized resistance of the nobility, led by John Cummin, crumbled, culminating in the formal surrender at Strathord. The great lords of Scotland, the Bruces, the Cummins, the Stuarts, the Greys, had, one by one, come to him to swear allegiance, accept fines, and have their lands restored. Scotland was, once again, a conquered province. Edward began the work of administering his new territory. He convened a parliament in St. Andrews and began drafting the ordinance for the establishment of the Dominion of Scotland, a document that would effectively abolish the old Scottish laws and Parliament, integrating the kingdom into the English crown. The war was over. The conquest was complete, except for one irritating detail, a single splinter under the king's fingernail: William Wallace. Amidst all the pardons, negotiations, and land restorations, one name was specifically and emphatically excluded from any clemency: The surrender of John Comyn and the other nobles included a clause obligating them to actively assist in the capture of Wallace. For Edward, the nobles were pragmatic political players whom he could understand, respect, and ultimately defeat and pardon. Wallace was something different. He was not a noble playing the feudal great game. He was a symbol. He was the personification of the very idea of Scotland, an idea that Edward needed to eradicate. Edward's determination to capture Wallace became a morbid and deeply personal obsession. It was no longer about military strategy. It was about revenge and the annihilation of a symbol. Wallace had humiliated Edward in a way that no French king or Welsh nobleman ever had. He had destroyed the Surrey army at Stirling. He had killed and flayed his treasurer. And worst of all, he had invaded England, sacking Northumberland and exposing the vulnerability of Edward's own kingdom. But Wallace's greatest crime, in Edward's eyes, was his stubbornness. He was the only man in all of Scotland who refused to bow down. This refusal was a direct affront to Edward's authority, a denial of his suzerainty and his divine right to rule. As long as Wallace lived, even as a starving outlaw hiding in a forest, his mere existence mocked Edward's conquest. He was living proof that Scotland was not dead. Thus, Edward I, the meticulous administrator and brilliant commander, poured disproportionate resources into hunting down a single man. He didn't want Wallace dead in a skirmish. That would make him an instant martyr. He wanted him alive. He wanted Wallace dragged to London, where he could be subjected to a show trial, publicly humiliated, and executed in the most brutal and instructive way possible, as an example to all traitors. The hunt was relentless. English sheriffs appointed in Scotland, such as Sir John de Segrave, had a single item at the top of their agendas: find Wallace. But the hunt was also entrusted to the Scots themselves. Nobles who wanted to prove their newfound loyalty to Edward and gain the vast rewards in land and gold became the most effective scouts. The net closed in around Wallace. The English king used espionage, informers, and treachery, turning neighbor against neighbor. Every friend of Wallace, every relative, every known sympathizer was under surveillance. Edward became a patient hunter. He might have pacified Scotland, but his personal war would only end when he had Wallace's body in his hands. Wallace's capture became the necessary epilogue to his great conquest. It was the final seal. And in a kingdom now ruled by fear and greed, where loyalty could be bought, it was only a matter of time before someone close enough to Wallace would yield to the price. The king's obsession would be satisfied not by an English soldier, but by the weakness of a fellow Scot. The year 1305 marked the end of the line for William Wallace. For 7 years, since his resignation as guardian, he had lived like a ghost, hunted by the English and Scots. Edward I's web, woven with gold, promises of land, and threats of death, was closing in. Every safe haven was becoming a trap, every friend a potential traitor. Scotland, exhausted by war and ruled by nobles who had made peace with Edward, was no longer a refuge. Wallace, the symbol of resistance, was dangerously alone. The reward for his head was astronomical, enough to transform a minor knight into a great lord. And it was a Scottish knight who finally succumbed to temptation. The man whose name would live in the eternal infamy of Scotland was Sir John de Menteith. Menteith was a complex figure, a perfect example of the divided nobility of the time. He had family ties with some of the most fervent patriots, but he was also a pragmatic politician who understood where real power resided. He had fought for the Scots on several occasions, but, like so many others, had submitted to Edward I to protect his lands and position. In 1305, he held a position of immense trust and power, appointed by Edward himself, governor of Dumbarton Castle. This position gave him military control over the western region of Scotland, precisely where Wallace frequently sought refuge. The capture, on August 3, 1305, was not the result of a heroic battle. It was a swift and dirty act of police treachery. Wallace was not defeated in combat. He was caught in a trap. The location was a hut in Robroyston, on the outskirts of Glasgow. Wallace was there, possibly sleeping, accompanied only by one or two of his most loyal followers, including, according to legend, the young Curly. The exact details of the betrayal are shrouded in folklore, each story attempting to explain how Scotland's greatest warrior could have been taken without a fight. One tradition claims that Menteith himself was not present, but that he used one of his servants, Jack Short, supposedly a relative of Wallace, to infiltrate the outlaws' inner circle. It was this servant who supposedly signaled to the soldiers, led by Menteith, the moment to attack. Another, more famous legend places Menteith at the scene. He is said to have arrived at the hut under the pretense of friendship or to bring news. The agreed-upon signal for the English soldiers hidden outside was a simple gesture at the dinner table, turning a loaf of bread upside down, a sign of bad luck and betrayal. Whatever the method, the result was the same. Wallace was caught by surprise. In his sleep or in a moment of carelessness, the soldiers stormed the hut. Curley was killed in the brief, desperate confusion. Wallace, possibly fighting with his bare hands or a dagger, was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Lion of Scotland, the man who had destroyed armies and terrified kings, was finally captured. He was immediately bound with chains. The capture was a triumph of Edward I's intelligence and Menteith's greed. Sir John de Menteith, for his service, received vast tracts of land and the eternal gratitude of the English king. To the Scots, however, he became Fos Menteith, a name that became synonymous with Judas. The prisoner, now in chains, was rushed south. He was not kept in Scotland, where his mere presence might inspire a rescue attempt. He was handed over directly to the English military authorities, specifically to Sir John de Segrave. Edward I's obsession was finally satisfied. He did not have Wallace's dead body, as he had feared. He had the man alive, in chains, ready to be displayed. Wallace's capture was not the end of a war. It was the triumph of a hunt. And the fact that it was a Scotsman who delivered Scotland's greatest patriot was the bitterest of all ironies, a grim symbol of how the nation had been divided and bought. Wallace's long journey south towards the show trial Edward had planned had begun. After his capture at Rob Royston, William Wallace, the man who had been guardian of Scotland and the terror of Edward I, was immediately handed over to the English military authorities. Sir John de Menteith, having fulfilled his act of treason, delivered his prize to Sir John de Segrave, Edward's principal commander in Scotland. The king's order was explicit. Wallace was to be brought to London alive, unharmed, and immediately. Edward's obsession was satisfied, and now the final act of his revenge would begin, an act not of war, but of political and legal theater. Wallace's journey from Glasgow to London, which began almost immediately in August 1305, was not a secret transport of a prisoner of state. It was a triumphal procession, a meticulously orchestrated public spectacle. Edward I didn't just want Wallace's body in London. He wanted all of England to see the Scottish monster in chains. Wallace was the king's most prized war trophy, the embodiment of an entire nation he had finally subdued. Chained hand and foot, Wallace was mounted on a horse and surrounded by a heavy contingent of guards. The procession moved slowly south, stopping at every major town and village along the way. From Carlisle to York, passing through Lincoln and St. Albans, news of his arrival spread ahead of them. At each stop, English crowds gathered. They had not come to see a defeated hero. They had come to see the Devil of Scotland, the murderer and thief that English chronicles and ballads had portrayed. He was the man who, according to the stories, ate English flesh and flayed the king's treasures. They expected to see a wild beast, a barbarian foaming with rage. What they saw, however, must have been profoundly disconcerting. Mounted on his horse, Wallace did not look like a defeated criminal. Legends and chronicles, even English ones, do not speak of him begging for mercy or cowering in fear. They describe a man of imposing stature whose physique alone was awe-inspiring. Even in chains, he maintained an air of defiance and dignity that silenced the insults. He looked at the jeering crowds not with hatred, but with a calm contempt, the contempt of a free man for his captors. This journey was the first battle of his execution, a psychological battle. And by refusing to appear broken, Wallace began to transform his own humiliation into a form of martyrdom. For Edward I, the public display served a dual purpose. For his English subjects, it was a reaffirmation of his power and the justice of his cause. It was proof that he had triumphed over his kingdom's most dangerous enemy. For the Scots who heard the news, it was a message of utter terror. See what happens to those who defy me. Your greatest hero, your guardian, is now my pet on a leash, being displayed for the entertainment of my peasants. The journey lasted more than 2 weeks, a torment of slow movement and constant humiliation. Finally, on August 22, 1305, the procession arrived on the outskirts of London. The kingdom's capital was in a state of frenzy. This was the greatest spectacle the city had seen in years. The mayor of London, Sir John Lebloun, accompanied by all the sheriffs and aldermen of the city, rode in his formal attire to meet the prisoner at Islington Green. What followed was the height of the spectacle. Wallace was stripped of his heaviest chains only to be tied to a horse and dragged through the cobblestone streets of London. The crowd, estimated at tens of thousands, packed every street, window, and rooftop. They shouted, booed, and threw rubbish, mud, and excrement at him. It was a carnival of hatred directed at the man who dared to defy his king. The procession carried him through the heart of the city, a final demonstration that he was no longer a warrior, but property of the state, being led to slaughter. He was not taken to the Tower of London, as many might have expected. Instead, he was placed in the custody of a prominent citizen, perhaps at the home of William the Laborer in the Fenchurch Street district. There, in the heart of the city that despised him, he spent his last night on earth, a prisoner on display, awaiting the show trial that would begin the following morning. The journey was over. Edward's hunt was complete. The lion was caged, and the stage was set for the final, most brutal act of vengeance. On the morning of August 23, 1305, William Wallace was awakened in his cell. The night at William the Laborer's house had been his last. He was chained once more and dragged outside. The London crowd, even larger and more bloodthirsty than the previous day, awaited him. He was tied, face down, to a horse and dragged for several miles through the cobblestone streets. From the city center to the Great Hall of Westminster, the judicial and ceremonial heart of the Kingdom of England. The dragging was not merely transport. It was the first part of the punishment, an act of humiliation and torture designed to break the prisoner even before he reached the court. He was ushered into the vast and imposing Westminster Hall, one of the largest halls in Europe, its beamed oak ceiling towering like a cathedral. The hall was packed. Nobles, knights, clergymen, judges, and wealthy citizens had thronged to witness the event. At the far end of the hall, on a raised bench, sat the king's commissioners, the judges in charge of this day. Among them was Sir Peter Mallory, the chief judge of the king's bench, a man who understood perfectly what his duty was not to judge, but to sentence. This event was never intended to be a trial. It was a show trial, in the purest sense of the term. A legal drama whose conclusion had been written by King Edward I himself, months, if not years, before. Wallace was not entitled to a lawyer. He could not call witnesses. No evidence would be presented, and no jury would be convened. He was there as an outlaw, someone who had already forfeited all legal rights. He was not there to be judged for his crimes, but to hear the list of them before his predetermined execution. Wallace, covered in dirt and blood from the dragging, was forced to stand before the judges. A court official began to read the long list of charges. It was a catalog of all the acts Wallace had committed since 1297, all twisted and framed by the singular and all-encompassing crime of high treason. He was accused of treason for violating his allegiance to King Edward I, to whom he supposedly owed loyalty. He was accused of murder, specifically that of the Sheriff of Lanark, a loyal officer of the king. He was accused of sacrilege for burning churches and killing clergymen, an accusation likely inflated, although war inevitably involved such acts. He was accused of unspeakable cruelty for the sack of Northumberland, portraying him as a barbaric monster. Every act of war he committed as guardian of Scotland on behalf of his exiled king, John Balliol, was perversely rewritten as an act of personal treason against Edward I. The legal logic was absurd. Wallace, as a Scottish subject, owed allegiance to the King of Scotland, John Balliol, not the King of England. He had never sworn an oath of fealty to Edward I, unlike nobles such as Bruce and Comyn, who had signed the ragman roll and then rebelled. Technically, Wallace was the only man in the room who we couldn't tone be guilty of treason, but that didn't matter. The law, on that day, was simply the will of King Edward. The trial was not to determine guilt, but to enumerate it. It was a ritual to dehumanize Wallace in the eyes of the world, to strip him of his titles of knight and guardian and reduce him to a thief and murderer. As the accusations echoed through the great hall, Wallace remained silent, a figure of immobile defiance. He listened to the long list of his alleged crimes, waiting. He knew he would have no defense, but he was determined to have his own word. The judges expected him to beg for mercy. The king expected him to finally bow. The stage was set for condemnation, but the drama was not yet over. The long, thunderous litany of accusations ended. A tense silence hung over the great hall of Westminster. William Wallace, dragged, dirty, and chained, stood before the most powerful judges in England. He had heard his acts of war for liberty rewritten as the crimes of a barbaric monster. The list of treason, murder, and sacrilege was designed to crush him under the legal and moral weight of the English crown. He had not yet uttered a word. The court expected a broken man, a commoner terrified by the majesty of Edward I's law. But before Sir Peter Mallory could demand his confession, before Wallace could speak, there was a final act of cruel theater to be performed. This show trial was not merely about the law. It was about ritualistic humiliation. A court official approached Wallace holding not a document but an object. It was not a golden crown, for that would be an honor. It was a simple crown, hastily woven from green leaves. English chronicles say it was a laurel wreath. Later Scottish traditions, perhaps more appropriately, call it an oak wreath. The symbolism, in both cases, was the same. It was a deep and bitter mockery. In Rome, the laurel wreath was the prize for a victorious poet or a triumphant general. By placing it on Wallace's head, the English judges were mocking his victories. It was a way of saying, do you consider yourself a great general? Do you consider yourself a conqueror for having invaded Northumberland? It was a triumph turned into a joke, an honor transformed into a joke. The interpretation of the oak is perhaps even darker and more accurate. The oak was the sacred tree of the ancient woods, the symbol of pagans and outlaws. By crowning Wallace with oak, they were demoting him from his position as guardian of Scotland, appointed by the church and the nobility, to something far more primitive. He was the king of the woods, the king of outlaws. It was a direct reference to the years he spent hiding in the forests of Ettrick and Selkirk. They were, in essence, of agreeing with the mocking nickname that the English soldiers themselves had given him. They were saying, you are not a knight. You are not a guardian. You are merely the king of bandits and thieves, and this is your crown of leaves. The officer placed the mocking crown on his head. The act was a grotesque echo of Christ's crowning with thorns. It was designed to provoke laughter from the crowd of nobles in the hall, to strip Wallace of his final dignity, to reduce him to a court jester in his own death trial. It was the centerpiece of Edward's revenge. It was not enough to kill Wallace's body. He first needed to kill his name, his title, and his honor. But, as with many acts of arrogance, the mockery had an unintended effect. By Gannaby placing the type of crown on Wallace's head, the English were, unwittingly, admitting his unique status. No other Scottish prisoner, no earl, baron, or bishop, deserved such a ritual. Bruce was not crowned with leaves. Cummin was not mocked in this way. Only Wallace. Only the man who, in their minds, had acted like a king, who had summoned parliaments and commanded armies like a sovereign, needed to be ritually uncrowned. The act of mockery was, in itself, an admission of his power. And then there was Wallace's reaction. The crowd may have laughed, but the prisoner did not flinch. He accepted the crown. The chronicles do not describe him trying to tear it off or bow in his head in shame. He wore it. On his head, the crown of leaves became a different symbol. Here, the king of outlaws, were to be an outlaw in the eyes of Edward I, was to be a free man. Here, the king of the woods, for the woods were the last sanctuary of Scottish liberty. He straightened up, chains hanging from his wrists and the ridiculous crown of leaves on his bloodied head, and looked at Sir Peter Mallory. He had endured the dragging, the accusations, and the mocking crown. He had remained silent. Edward's ritual of humiliation was complete. Now, and only now, did the court address him. They had called him a traitor 20 times. The judge probably asked if he had anything to say in the face of such crushing accusations, hoping for a final confession, a plea for mercy that the king might then magnanimously reject. The room fell silent, waiting for the king of outlaws to finally break and beg. Westminster's great hall hung in a tense silence. The king of outlaws, crowned with leaves, bloodied from the dragging, had listened to the long list of his alleged crimes. The chief judge, Sir Peter Mallory, looked at the prisoner, awaiting the final confession, the plea for clemency that would complete the ritual of submission. The central accusation, the linchpin supporting the entire show trial, was one word: treason. All other charges, murder, sacrilege, arson, were merely manifestations of this singular and supreme offense. The judges had declared him a traitor to King Edward I, his overlord. It was then, at that moment of heightened expectation that William Wallace finally broke his silence. His voice, according to the chronicles that recorded the event, was not that of a broken man pleading for his life. It was clear, strong, and resonated with a legal and moral conviction that shocked the court. He did not address the murder charges. He did not deny burning English towns. He went straight to the heart of the matter, to the very legitimacy of the trial. Faced with the accusation of high treason, Wallace gave his one and only immortal defense. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward," he declared, "for I was never his subject." This simple yet devastating phrase was not an emotional appeal. It was a brilliant, albeit futile, legal argument. In the feudal law that governed their world, treason was not a vague concept of patriotism. It was a specific legal crime, the breaking of an oath of fealty sworn to a lord. It was a violated feudal contract. What Wallace was declaring to the entire English court was an inconvenient and undeniable truth. Almost all the other Scottish nobles, Robert the Bruce, John Comyn, the Earls of Angus and Dunbar, James Stuart, were, in fact, traitors from Edward's perspective. They had all, at some point, most notably when signing the Ragman Roll in 1296, placed their hands between Edward's and swore to be his men. When they took up arms, they technically broke an oath, but William Wallace never did. He was perhaps the only significant military leader in Scotland who had never signed the Ragman Roll, never paid homage, never acknowledged Edward I as his Lord High. His defense was irrefutable. He could not betray an oath he never swore. He was not a rebellious subject. He was an enemy captured in war. He owed his loyalty, as he always maintained, only to his true and only king, John Balliol. This declaration was a breathtaking act of defiance. In Westminster Hall, the center of Edward's power, Wallace was effectively negating the very premise of Edward's conquest of Scotland. He was telling the chief judge that the king had no jurisdiction over him. The oak crown on his head suddenly seemed less a mockery and more a symbol of truth. He was, in fact, a sovereign in his own right, a man whose loyalty was not for sale and had never been taken. The court was stunned. The judges were furious. This was not the confession they wanted. It was a rejection of the court's own authority. Sir Peter Mallory, recovering, would have dismissed the argument as sophistry. But Wallace was not finished. As for the other accusations, he did not deny them. According to the chronicles, he openly admitted what he had done. Yes, he had killed Englishmen. Yes, he had invaded Northumberland. Yes, he had waged war against King Edward. But he did not admit to them as crimes. He claimed them as acts of war, carried out in his duty as guardian of Scotland, in the name of his king, against the enemies and invaders of his kingdom. He wasn't pleading for mercy. He was making a final political statement. He transformed his own treason trial into a trial of Edward's illegal claim to Scotland. He proved, with his single sentence, that he was not a traitor, but a patriot. The court had nothing more to say. Wallace's defense, though legally sound, was politically impossible to accept. To acknowledge it would be to admit that Edward's entire war had been illegal. The verdict was already written, but Wallace had won the moral battle. He had claimed his own narrative and sealed his legacy as a free man. William Wallace's defense, "I cannot be a traitor, for I never swore allegiance to him," echoed in the great hall of Westminster like thunder. It was a final act of defiance that exposed the legal farce of the trial. But it was, of course, futile. The court was not there to debate the complexities of feudal law. It was there to execute the will of King Edward I. Wallace's denial only sealed his fate and likely increased the judge's fury. Sir Peter Mallory, the chief judge, rose to pronounce the sentence. The verdict was already known, but the sentence needed to be read in all its gruesome detail, for it served a crucial purpose. This was not merely a death sentence. It was a sentence of symbolic annihilation, a standard medieval punishment for the crime of high treason, designed to terrify anyone who even thought of defying the king. It was a death in 4 parts, each a specific punishment for an aspect of Wallace's crime. First, Mallory condemned him for his treason. For this crime, he would be hanged drawn. Wallace had already been dragged by horses from his cell to Westminster Hall, but this was only the beginning. The formal sentence dictated that he would be tied to a wooden fence and dragged by horses for several miles through the cobblestone streets of London, from the city center to the execution site at Smithfield. This act was symbolic. Just as he had lowered the king's majesty, he would be lowered, dragged through the mud and dung of the city, below even the lowest of commoners. Secondly, he was convicted of his murders, robberies, and arson, acts of war he had admitted to. For these crimes, he would be hanged. But, crucially, he would not have the mercy of a quick death. He would be hanged with a noose, but cut before death could bring him relief. Still breathing, he would hover between life and death, experiencing the agony of strangulation, only to be denied his end. Third, he was condemned for his most heinous crimes in the eyes of the court, sacrileges against churches and, symbolically, against the body politic of the kingdom. For these crimes, which he committed while still alive, he would be disemboweled, drawn, in the modern interpretation, and castrated. An executioner would cut him from the abdomen to the throat. His internal organs, intestines, liver, heart would be ripped from his body and burned in a bonfire before his very eyes. This was the most brutally personal aspect of the punishment, a purification by fire of his inner corruption. Fourth, and finally, he was condemned for spreading treachery throughout the kingdom. For this crime, his body, once dead, would be quartered, his head would be cut off, his torso would be divided into 4 parts. These remains would not have the honor of a Christian burial. They would be sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a horrific and lasting warning. As Sir Peter Mallory read this horrific sentence, the hall likely fell into absolute silence. It was terror in the form of law. This was the punishment reserved for the worst enemies of the state. For Wallace, standing there, chained and crowned with leaves, this was no longer a battle of swords, but of will. He showed no fear. He had faced death 1,000 times on the battlefield. Now he would face it on the executioner's scaffold. There was no appeal. There was no delay. The sentence was pronounced and its execution ordered to begin immediately. The show trial was over. The nobles and judges in Westminster Hall had done their part. Now, the executioner and the bloodthirsty mob of London would have theirs. Wallace was seized by the guards, dragged out of the hall, and tied to the wooden railing. The final and longest part of his journey had begun. The sentence pronounced in Westminster Hall was not a future threat. It was an immediate order. The show trial had ended hastily, and the spectacle of the execution would now begin. William Wallace was dragged out of the hall and tied, face down, to a wooden railing. The journey of several miles to Smithfield, the execution site and cattle market outside the city walls, was the first part of the torture. The crowd, which hours before had thrown rubbish, was now in a bloodthirsty frenzy, knowing what was coming. They punched, kicked, and spat on him as horses dragged him mercilessly over the sharp stones and dirt of the London streets. He arrived at the scaffold not just as a prisoner, but as a piece of flesh already torn and bleeding. Smithfield was packed. It was a suit holiday. Vendors sold pies and beer. A huge wooden platform, the scaffold, had been erected in the center, with a gallows and a bonfire already lit beside it. Wallace was untied from the railing and forced up the steps, his honor guards being the executioner and his assistants. He was stripped, perhaps to the waist, so that the crowd could see the executioner at work. Present at the scaffold, besides the executioner, were probably clergymen, ready to hear a final confession, and the king's officers, including Sir John de Segre, to ensure that Edward I's sentence was carried out to the letter. The executioner, hooded and professional, began his work. First, the gallows. Wallace had the noose placed around his neck. He was then hoisted or pushed off the platform. The crowd roared, but as the sentence dictated, this was not an execution to kill. It was to torture. Wallace was strangled, kicking in the air, the agony of asphyxiation beginning until the exact point of death. Then, still breathing, he was lowered. He was thrown onto a butcher's table on the scaffold. The crowd could now see him up close, convulsing, struggling for air, but still conscious. It was at this moment that the officers probably offered him one last chance at mercy. Not to save his life, for it was lost, but to save his soul and perhaps hasten his end. They demanded that he confess his crimes, repent of his treachery, and beg for the pardon of his master. King Edward I, it was at this moment, at the lowest point of his physical agony, that William Wallace fought his final battle and achieved his greatest victory. The English chroniclers who recorded the event, though hostile to him, note his defiance. Wallace refused. With the voice he had left. He refused to ask forgiveness from the traitor Edward I. He regretted nothing, except according to legend, not having killed more Englishmen. He recognized no authority over him, except that of God. Seeing that he would not break, the executioner took his long, sharp knife. He began the most horrific act, the disembowelment. He cut open Wallace's abdomen. The crowd watched in horrific fascination as the executioner plunged his hands into the prisoner's still living body and ripped out his intestines. The entrails were thrown onto the bonfire beside him to burn before his eyes. Scottish legend, attempting to find humanity in this hell, claims that Wallace, in his final moments, did not cry out for mercy. Instead, he is said to have asked a sympathetic friar to hold a crucifix before his eyes, so that the last thing he saw on earth would not be his own body being mutilated, but the symbol of his savior. The torture continued. He was castrated. Finally, when his body was nearly bloodless, the executioner, in a single act of mercy, took his axe or sword and cut out Wallace's heart. That heart, which had defied a king and liberated a nation, was held aloft for all to see before being thrown into the fire with the rest of his organs. Only then was the body lowered. The executioner picked up his heavy axe and began the final part of the sentence. He cut off Wallace's head. Then he cut the body into 4 pieces. The execution at Smithfield was over. It had lasted for hours. William Wallace, the man, was dead. But the act of brutality calculated by Edward I to erase Wallace from memory had the opposite effect. By refusing to break, by refusing to ask for forgiveness, Wallace had transformed his own execution from an act of true justice into an act of barbaric martyrdom. The execution at Smithfield was over. The scaffold was soaked in blood, the pyre reduced to ashes and grease, and the executioner had completed his terrible task. For King Edward I, August 23, 1305, represented the absolute end of his Scottish problem. The man who had defied his power, humiliated his armies, and mocked his claim to suzerainty was finally silenced and destroyed. The king's justice, in all its brutal majesty, had been demonstrated. The next step was not about justice, it was about politics. Wallace's execution was not designed merely to punish the man. It was designed to kill the very idea of Scotland. Wallace's dismembered body became the primary instrument of this campaign of psychological terror. His remains would not have the dignity of a tomb, nor the sanctity of Christian soil. They would be converted into tools of propaganda, a sermon of power written in flesh and blood. Wallace's head was the first to be prepared. It was taken from the execution platform and plunged into a cauldron of boiling tar. This was not a random act of desecration, but a grotesque method of preservation, ensuring the head would take a long time to decompose, prolonging the spectacle for months. Once prepared, the head was carried in procession to London Bridge, the southern gate of the city, and one of the busiest structures in Europe. There, it was impaled on a long iron spear and raised atop the South Gatehouse, the traditional location reserved for the kingdom's most infamous traitors. Wallace's head, crowned with mocking leaves, now hung on a pole, staring lifelessly at the city that had condemned him. It was the most prominent warning possible. It was the first sight to greet merchants, pilgrims, and ambassadors. And most importantly, it was a daily message to the captive or visiting Scottish nobles in London. Edward, I was saying, here is your guardian, here is your hero. I rule even over your dead. But the harshest message was reserved for Scotland itself. The 4 pieces of his torso were sent north, each to a strategic city, a physical reminder that Edward's power was omnipresent. The right arm was displayed in Newcastle at Pontine, the English border town that Wallace had dared to invade. The left arm was sent to Berwick-upon-Tweed, the Scottish town whose massacre by Edward had, in many respects, started the war. The right leg was sent to Perth, also known as St. Johnstone, a vital administrative and political center in the heart of Scotland. And in the final act of cruel mockery, Wallace's left leg was sent and publicly displayed in Stirling, the site of his greatest victory, a deliberate desecration of his greatest triumph. Edward's plan was, by medieval logic, infallible. He had destroyed the body, scattered the remains, and proven that resistance was futile. He had transformed the hero of Scotland into 4 pieces of rotting flesh at the 4 city gates. But Edward I, a master of war and law, made a profound psychological miscalculation. He understood the power of fear, but he did not understand the power of martyrdom. The brutality of the execution did not inspire the terror he intended. In Scotland, it inspired a revulsion and anger that transcended politics. The common people, who already adored Wallace, saw the torture at Smithfield not as the justice of a king, but as the barbarity of a tyrant. The execution was not the end of Wallace. It was his purification. While Wallace was alive, he was a flawed and divisive man. The high nobility despised him as an opportunist. His defeat at Falkirk was a stain on his legacy, proof that his rule as guardian had failed. But William Wallace, the martyr, was perfect. His agonizing death, his utter refusal to ask Edward for forgiveness, his defiant legal defense in Westminster, all this erased his failures. The man who resigned in disgrace after Falkirk now became, in death, the immortal symbol of liberty itself. The places where their limbs were displayed did not become memorials of fear. They became silent sanctuaries of defiance. People did not look at those decaying remains with submission. They looked with hardened rage. Edward, in his attempt to erase Wallace from history, inadvertently etched him into it forever. He had killed a weary, hunted outlaw and, in the process, created the immortal legend of Braveheart. He had killed a man, but he had created a patron saint, a ghost that would haunt the English occupation and inspire a new and far more successful generation of resistance. August 1305. Scotland was, by any statesman's logic, dead. Its greatest hero, William Wallace, had been turned into a grotesque spectacle, his head impaled on London Bridge, his limbs serving as warnings in Stirling, Perth, Berwick, and Newcastle. King Edward I was the absolute master. The ordinance for the government of Scotland was being implemented, and the Scottish nobles, including the two most powerful men, Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, had sworn allegiance and were serving on Edward's new governing council. Resistance was crushed, the symbol of resistance dismembered. The political landscape was one of total submission. The economic landscape, that of a province being reabsorbed by the English administrative engine. Wallace's journey had ended in utter failure, but Edward I's attempt to terrorize Scotland into submission using Wallace's remains was his greatest miscalculation. The brutality of the execution did not create fear. It forged a cold, inextinguishable hatred. Wallace's martyrdom transformed a flawed military leader into a perfect ideal. He proved, with his own blood, that Edward's peace was tyranny and that compromise was impossible. This revelation did not resonate with the common people. They already knew it. It resonated finally in the heart of the most unlikely man, Robert the Bruce. Bruce was the opposite of Wallace. Where Wallace was upstart and wavering, Bruce was a pragmatic aristocrat. Where Wallace was a patriot, Bruce was a politician with a legitimate claim to the throne. Bruce had wavered for a decade. He swore allegiance to Edward in 1296, rebelled, and was guardian. With Comyn surrendered to Edward again in 1302, and was, at the time of Wallace's execution, loyal to the English crown. Wallace's death showed Bruce that no matter how noble he was or how many times he bowed, in Edward's eyes he would never be a king. He would be, at best, a servant. Scotland could not have two leaders. The only other viable claim to the throne belonged to John the Red Comyn. If Scotland wanted to rise again, it needed a single king, a single cause. The lesson of Wallace's unity and the lesson of Falkirk, the treachery of the nobles, hung over Bruce. On February 10, 1306, just 6 months after Wallace's head was displayed, Bruce summoned Comyn to a meeting at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. The two rivals met before the altar. The words exchanged are unknown, but the outcome was the point of no return in Scottish history. A violent argument erupted. Bruce drew his dagger and stabbed Comyn by killing his rival on the altar of a church. Bruce became a man triply condemned. He was a traitor to Edward I, a murderer in the eyes of the law, and a sacrilegious man excommunicated by the church. He was suddenly in the same position Wallace had been throughout his career, an absolute outlaw with nothing to lose and no possibility of forgiveness. Bruce's hesitation was over. He had no choice anymore. Wallace's execution was the inspiration. Comyn's murder was the action. 6 weeks later, in March 1306, Robert the Bruce rode to Scone, the place where Edward had stolen the Stone of Destiny and had himself crowned King Robert I of Scotland. Rebellion was ablaze again. But this was a new war. It was not a rebellion in the name of an absent king. It was a war of independence led by a present king. Edward I Longshanks, enraged by this new betrayal, died in 1307 on his way north to crush Bruce, his obsession with Wallace replaced by an obsession with Bruce. His son, Edward II, was a weak commander. Bruce, unlike Wallace, was a shrewd politician and a brutal warrior. He learned from the mistakes of Falkirk. He spent years waging the same guerrilla war that Wallace had waged, slowly uniting the nation, earl by earl, castle by castle. The political and economic scenario culminated in 1314. Edward II's army, similar to his father's, invaded Scotland. But the king they faced at Bannockburn was Robert the Bruce, a master of war who had learned Wallace's lesson. Bruce used Wallace's schiltrons of spearmen, but crucially, he did not allow his archers to be massacred. He used his cavalry. First to attack and destroy Edward II's Welsh archers. Then, his common schiltrons, Wallace's tactic, advanced and destroyed the English heavy cavalry in open field. Bannockburn was Falkirk's revenge, Wallace's tactic executed with Bruce's noble precision. Wallace's journey ended on the scaffold, but Scotland's journey ended at Bannockburn. The final political scene was not that of an English province, but of a sovereign and victorious kingdom, united under a warrior king who had been inspired by the martyrdom of an outlaw. The economic scene, though devastated by war, was now that of a nation free to trade with the world. Just as Wallace and Moray had written to the merchants of Lubeck so many years before, after the victory at Stirling. Wallace was the martyr. Bruce was the king who reaped the sacrifice and secured freedom.